Hello everyone. I am the Scaryteller, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable, relax, and let's delve into tonight's true scary stories. Story 1. The old man who sold us the house on the outskirts of Austin told us it had good bones. And that's what my wife, Sarah, and I clung to as we navigated the labyrinth of paperwork and inspections. It was a sprawling two-story Victorian, a relic from a time when cotton was king and this part of Texas was still the frontier. It had peeling white paint, a wraparound porch that sagged in places, and windows that looked like vacant eyes. But it was ours, a place to finally set down roots after years of apartment living. We were young, optimistic, and utterly unprepared. The first few weeks were a whirlwind of unpacking boxes and painting walls. We stripped away layers of faded floral wallpaper, revealing the solid shiplap beneath. We sanded and stained the original hardwood floors, their deep, rich grain a testament to the house's history. It was hard work, but with every improvement, the house felt more like our own. The strangeness began subtly, so subtly that we dismissed it as the quirks of an old house. A door creaking open on its own, the floorboards groaning in the dead of night, a cold spot in the upstairs hallway that never seemed to warm up. "It's just the house settling," I'd say, and Sarah would nod, though I could see the flicker of unease in her eyes. Then came the noises. Not the usual groans and creaks, but something more deliberate. The sound of footsteps pacing in the attic above our bedroom, slow and heavy, like a man wearing work boots. I'd grab a flashlight and climb the rickety pull-down stairs, my heart pounding in my chest, only to find the attic empty and thick with dust, untouched for what looked like decades. There were no footprints, no sign of any disturbance. Yet, the moment I was back in bed, the pacing would resume, a relentless, maddening rhythm that kept us awake until the first light of dawn. Sarah started having nightmares. She'd wake up screaming, her body drenched in sweat, talking about a woman in a white dress who would stand at the foot of our bed, her face obscured by shadows, whispering things Sarah couldn't understand. I tried to comfort her, to tell her it was just the stress of the move, the unfamiliarity of a new place. But deep down, a cold dread was beginning to take root in my own heart. I'd started seeing things too. Fleeting shadows in my peripheral vision, a flicker of movement in a darkened doorway, the distinct feeling of being watched when I was alone in the house. One evening, I was in the kitchen making dinner, while Sarah was out getting groceries. The sun was setting, casting long, eerie shadows across the room. I was chopping vegetables when I heard it, a soft, melodic humming coming from the living room. It was a lullaby, a tune I didn't recognize, but it was filled with a profound sadness that sent a shiver down my spine. I walked into the living room, and the humming stopped. The room was empty. The rocking chair we'd bought at a flea market was gently swaying back and forth, as if someone had just gotten up from it. I stood there, frozen, the kitchen knife still in my hand, my mind racing to find a logical explanation. A draft? The unevenness of the old floorboards? But I knew it was something more. The activity in the house began to escalate. Objects would move on their own. A book would fly off a shelf, a picture frame would crash to the floor, a glass would slide across the countertop. We'd come home to find all the kitchen cabinets wide open, their contents undisturbed. It was as if something was trying to get our attention, to make its presence known in the most unsettling ways possible. We were living in a constant state of anxiety, our nerves frayed, our sleep shattered. The house that was supposed to be our dream home had become our prison. We started researching the history of the house, hoping to find some clue, some explanation for what was happening. We spent hours at the local library, poring over old records and newspaper archives. What we found chilled us to the bone. The house had been built in the late 1800s by a wealthy cotton baron named Jedediah Kane. He was a cruel and ruthless man, known for his violent temper and his mistreatment of his workers. He had a wife, Elara, a gentle and beautiful woman who was said to be deeply unhappy in her marriage. The records showed that Elara had died in the house under mysterious circumstances. The official cause of death was listed as a fall down the stairs, but there were rumors, whispers of foul play, of a husband's rage that had finally gone too far. The archives also mentioned a daughter, Lily, who had died of a fever a few years later. The townspeople said the house was cursed, that the spirits of Elara and Lily were trapped within its walls, their sorrow and anger seeping into the very foundation of the building. Armed with this knowledge, the strange occurrences in the house took on a new and terrifying meaning. The pacing in the attic was Jedediah, forever restless, forever angry. The humming lullaby was Alara, singing to the child she had lost. The moving objects were Lily, a playful spirit whose games had a sinister edge. We were no longer just living in a haunted house. We were living with the ghosts of a tragic and violent past. We tried everything to cleanse the house. We burned sage, we hung crucifixes, we even brought in a priest to perform a blessing. But nothing worked. The activity only seemed to intensify, as if our attempts to banish the spirits were only making them angrier. The woman in white, Alara, began to appear to me as well. I'd see her standing in the hallway, her form translucent, her face a mask of sorrow. She never spoke, but her eyes, filled with an unbearable pain, pleaded with me, as if she was trying to tell me something, to warn me. The breaking point came one night in late October. A storm was raging outside, the wind howling like a banshee, the rain lashing against the windows. The power had gone out, plunging the house into a thick, oppressive darkness. We were huddled together in the living room, a single candle casting flickering shadows on the walls. The house was alive with noise. The sound of a woman sobbing, a child's laughter echoing from the upstairs bedrooms, and the heavy, menacing footsteps of Jedediah, pacing, always pacing. Suddenly, a deafening crash came from the kitchen. We both jumped, our hearts in our throats. I grabbed the flashlight, its beam cutting a nervous path through the darkness, and cautiously made my way to the kitchen. The room was in disarray. The cabinets were all open, their contents strewn across the floor. In the center of the room, a single word was scrawled on the floor in what looked like blood: "Get out." That was it. We couldn't take it anymore. We fled the house that night, leaving everything behind. We didn't pack a bag, we didn't grab any of our belongings. We just ran out into the storm, away from the house that had become our tormentor. We drove until the sun came up, until the memory of the house was a distant, nightmarish blur. We never went back. We sold the house at a massive loss to a developer who planned to tear it down and build a subdivision. We never told him about the ghosts, about the things we had seen and heard. We just wanted to be free of it, to put the whole terrifying experience behind us. It's been years since we left that house in Texas. We live in a small, modern apartment now, a place with no history, no secrets. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I can still hear it. The faint sound of a woman humming a sad lullaby, the echo of a child's laughter, the relentless, heavy footsteps of a man who will never find peace. And I know that the house may be gone, but the spirits that inhabited it are still out there, waiting, watching, in the house that never sleeps. Story 2. The first time I saw her, I thought I was looking in a mirror. Same shoulder-length brown hair, same green eyes, even the same tiny scar above my left eyebrow from a childhood accident. But this was no reflection. It was a living, breathing woman who could have been my twin. Our eyes met across the crowded dining room, and I felt a chill run down my spine. As she smiled and waved, I knew with sickening certainty that my relaxing Caribbean cruise had just taken a turn into uncharted waters. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and until that moment, I'd been enjoying a much-needed vacation aboard the Majestic Dream, a luxury cruise liner making its way through the turquoise waters of the Caribbean. I'm a 32-year-old software engineer from Seattle, and this was my first real vacation in years. I'd been looking forward to 10 days of sun, relaxation, and maybe a little romance if I was lucky. The first few days had been everything I'd hoped for. I'd lounged by the pool, indulged in far too many fruity cocktails, and even struck up a flirtation with a handsome guy named Mike who was traveling with a group of friends. It was on the fourth night, at the captain's dinner, that everything changed. I'd dressed up for the occasion, wearing a new blue dress I'd bought specifically for the cruise. As I made my way into the grand dining room, I caught sight of myself in one of the large, decorative mirrors and paused to adjust my hair. That's when I saw her. At first, I thought it was just my reflection from a different angle, but as I turned to look directly at her, I realized with a jolt that she was a separate person, a person who looked exactly like me, down to the smallest detail. Our eyes met, and for a moment, the bustling dining room seemed to fade away. She smiled and waved, as if we were old friends. I felt rooted to the spot, my mind reeling. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of elaborate prank or a very vivid hallucination. A waiter bumped into me, breaking the spell. By the time I looked back, she was gone, lost in the sea of passengers making their way to their tables. Throughout dinner, I couldn't focus on the conversation at my table. My eyes kept scanning the room, looking for my doppelganger. I saw her once, sitting at a table across the room, but when I blinked, she was gone again. Sarah, are you okay? Mike's voice brought me back to the present. You look like you've seen a ghost. I forced a laugh. Sorry, just a bit tired, I guess. Must be all that sun. But as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. Who was she? And why did she look exactly like me? The next morning, I was determined to find her and get some answers. I spent hours wandering the ship, checking every restaurant, lounge, and deck, but there was no sign of her. It wasn't until late afternoon that I saw her again. I was heading back to my cabin to get ready for dinner when I caught a glimpse of her turning a corner at the end of the hallway. I broke into a run, but when I rounded the corner, the corridor was empty. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, my face, smiling at me across the dining room. Around 2 a.m., I gave up on sleep and decided to take a walk to clear my head. The ship was eerily quiet as I made my way through the deserted corridors. I found myself on one of the upper decks, leaning against the railing and staring out at the moonlit ocean. That's when I heard it, footsteps behind me, soft but distinct. I turned, half expecting to see my double. Instead, it was Mike, looking surprised to see me. Sarah, what are you doing up so late? I hesitated, then decided to take a chance. Mike, this is going to sound crazy, but have you seen anyone on the ship who looks like me? I mean exactly like me. He frowned, looking confused. What do you mean? I told him everything, about seeing my doppelganger at dinner, about chasing her through the ship. As I spoke, I could see the concern growing in his eyes. Sarah, he said gently when I'd finished, I think maybe you should talk to the ship's doctor. Stress can do funny things to a person's mind. I'm not crazy, I snapped, then immediately felt guilty at the hurt look on his face. I'm sorry. I know what I saw, Mike. She's real. He nodded, but I could tell he didn't believe me. Okay, look, why don't we do some investigating tomorrow? If there really is someone who looks that much like you on the ship, other people must have noticed too, right? I agreed, grateful for his support even if he thought I was losing my mind. We made plans to meet for breakfast, and I headed back to my cabin, feeling slightly better. That night, I dreamed of mirrors, endless corridors lined with mirrors, each one showing a slightly different version of myself. I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. The next few days were a blur of paranoia and fruitless searching. Mike and I questioned other passengers, checked passenger lists, even bribed a junior crew member to let us look at security camera footage. But there was no sign of my mysterious double. Other passengers were starting to give me strange looks. I'd overhear whispers as I passed, see people pointing and talking in low voices. More than once, someone approached me, insisting they'd just seen me in a completely different part of the ship. Mike stuck by me, but I could tell his patience was wearing thin. Maybe it was just someone who looked a lot like you, he suggested one afternoon as we sat by the pool. And now you're just seeing what you expect to see. I wanted to believe him, but deep down, I knew what I'd seen, and I was becoming more and more convinced that something very strange was happening on this ship. It all came to a head on the 8th night of the cruise. I was walking back to my cabin after a late-night movie when I saw her again. She was standing at the end of the corridor watching me. This time, I was determined not to let her get away. I ran towards her, calling out, "Wait, who are you? Why do you look like me?" She turned and fled, and I chased her through the twisting corridors of the ship, upstairs, down hallways, through lounges and restaurants. It was like a maze, and more than once I found myself in parts of the ship I'd never seen before. Finally, I cornered her in a dead-end hallway. She stood with her back to me, shoulders heaving as if she'd been running too. "Please," I gasped out of breath. "Just tell me who you are." Slowly, she turned to face me, and as she did, I felt the world tilt sideways. Her face was mine, yes, but it was wrong somehow. The proportions were slightly off, the eyes a little too large, the smile a little too wide. As I watched in horror, her features seemed to ripple and shift, like a reflection in disturbed water. "Who am I?" she said, and her voice was a distorted version of my own. "I'm you, Sarah. Or rather, I'm who you could be, who you might become." She took a step towards me, and I stumbled backward, my back hitting the wall. What are you?" Her smile widened impossibly. "I'm a possibility, a potential future. This ship, it exists in a place where realities intersect, where different versions of ourselves can meet." My mind reeled, trying to make sense of her words. "But why? Why show yourself to me?" She laughed, and the sound sent shivers down my spine. "To give you a choice, of course. You can go back to your life, your safe, predictable existence. Or you can embrace the unknown, become something more. As she spoke, I noticed something behind her. The end of the hallway was shifting, shimmering like a heat haze. And beyond it, I caught glimpses of other places, other realities. She held out her hand. "Come with me, Sarah. See what you could become." For a moment, I was tempted. The promise of adventure, of the unknown, pulled at me. But then I thought of my life back home, of my friends and family, of Mike, probably worried sick about where I'd disappeared to. I shook my head. "No, this is my reality, my life. And I choose it." Her face twisted in anger, becoming less and less human by the second. "You'll regret this," she hissed. And then, before I could react, she lunged at me. I closed my eyes, bracing for impact, but it never came. Instead, I felt a rush of wind, a sensation of falling, and then nothing. When I opened my eyes, I was back in my cabin. Sunlight was streaming through the porthole, and the sounds of passengers enjoying the morning filtered in from the hallway. For a moment, I thought it had all been a dream. But then I noticed something on my bedside table. A small silver pendant shaped like a key, something I'd never seen before but that looked strangely familiar. I picked it up, and as I did, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror. For just a second, I could have sworn my reflection smiled at me with a mouth that was a little too wide. The rest of the cruise passed uneventfully. I never saw my doppelganger again, and eventually, I managed to convince myself that stress and too much sun had played tricks on my mind. Mike and I grew closer, and by the time we docked, we were making plans to see each other back in the real world. But sometimes late at night, I find myself looking at that silver key, and I wonder about roads not taken, about other versions of myself and other realities. And I can't help but think that somewhere out there, on a ship sailing through the spaces between worlds, another Sarah made a very different choice. So if you ever find yourself on a cruise and catch a glimpse of someone who looks just like you, remember my story, and think very carefully about the choices you make. Because sometimes our doubles are more than just reflections. Sometimes they're glimpses of who we might become, for better or for worse. Story 3. The shovel struck something hard, sending a jolt up my arms. I paused, wiping sweat from my brow with a muddy hand. We'd been digging for hours, and the well was supposed to be nothing but dirt for at least another 10 feet. I called down to my son, Jake, who was working beside me in the hole. "Hey, grab the flashlight, will you? I think we hit something." Little did I know, that metallic clang would be the sound that changed everything. I'd inherited this farm from my uncle 6 months ago. It was a fixer-upper, to put it mildly, but it was a chance for a fresh start after the divorce. Jake and I had thrown ourselves into the work, fixing fences, repairing the barn, and now, digging a new well. The old one had run dry years ago, and we needed water if we were going to make a go of this place. Jake shone the flashlight where my shovel had struck. The beam reflected off something smooth and metallic, a stark contrast to the dark earth surrounding it. "What is that, Dad?" Jake asked, his voice a mix of curiosity and apprehension. I shrugged, already scraping away more dirt with my hands. "I don't know, Bud. Let's find out." As we dug, the object began to take shape. It was a metal container, about the size of a small suitcase. It looked old, the once shiny surface now pitted and corroded. My mind raced with possibilities. A time capsule, buried treasure, or just some farmer's junk tossed in a hole and forgotten. It took another hour of careful digging to free the container from the earth. By the time we hauled it out of the well, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the field. We carried our find back to the barn, both of us silent, lost in our own thoughts about what might be inside. Under the harsh glare of the barn's floodlights, I examined the container more closely. It was sealed tight, with no obvious way to open it. A faded inscription was barely visible on one side, but years of corrosion had made it illegible. "Should we open it?" Jake asked, practically bouncing with excitement. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to call the police, or maybe a lawyer. What if this was evidence of something? But curiosity won out. "All right," I said, reaching for a crowbar. "Stand back." It took some effort, but finally the lid creaked open. The smell hit us first, musty and damp like an old cellar. Inside, protected by layers of waxy paper, was a stack of documents and photographs. I picked up the first photo, holding it under the light. It showed a young woman, maybe in her early 20s, smiling at the camera. The picture was old, probably from the 1960s, judging by her hairstyle and clothes. I turned it over. On the back, in faded ink, was written, Sarah Milligan, 1964. Jake peered over my shoulder. "Who's that, Dad?" I shook my head. I don't know. But as I said it, a nagging feeling started in the pit of my stomach. The name Milligan sounded familiar, but I couldn't place why. We spent the next hour going through the contents of the box. There were more photos, all of the same young woman, Sarah, at various locations around what looked like this very farm. There were also letters, newspaper clippings, and a small leather-bound journal. As I flipped through the journal, a yellowed newspaper clipping fell out. The headline made my blood run cold. Local woman still missing after 3 months. I read the article quickly, my heart pounding. Sarah Milligan had disappeared from her family's farm in the summer of 1964. Despite an extensive search, no trace of her was ever found. The article mentioned that Sarah's father, the owner of the farm, was the primary suspect but was never charged due to lack of evidence. Dad, Jake's voice snapped me back to the present. What's wrong? I looked at my son, trying to keep my voice steady. Jake, I think we just found evidence in a very old missing persons case. His eyes widened. Really? Like a real mystery? I nodded, my mind racing. Yeah, bud. A real mystery. I started gathering up the documents, careful not to disturb them more than necessary. We need to call the police. The next few hours were a blur. Deputies came out to the farm, followed by detectives and a crime scene unit. Our quiet little farmhouse became the center of a whirlwind of activity. Jake and I were questioned separately, telling and retelling how we'd found the box. It was past midnight when things finally calmed down. The box and its contents had been taken away as evidence, and we'd been told not to discuss the case with anyone. As if we knew anyone to discuss it with. We were still new in town, barely knew our neighbors. I tucked Jake into bed, his head full of excitement about our discovery. But sleep eluded me. I sat at the kitchen table, a cold cup of coffee in front of me, staring out at the darkened fields. What had happened to Sarah Milligan? And why did her name sound so familiar? The next morning, I drove into town, determined to do some digging of my own. The local library was small, but it had archives of the town's newspaper going back decades. I spent hours poring over microfilm, reading everything I could about the Milligan case. Sarah had been 23 when she disappeared, engaged to be married. Her fiancé had reported her missing when she didn't show up for a date. The last person to see her was her father, James Milligan, who claimed she'd left the farm to run errands in town. As I read, pieces started falling into place. James Milligan. That was my uncle's name, the uncle who'd left me this farm. With a growing sense of dread, I realized why Sarah's name had sounded familiar. My mother had mentioned her once, years ago, a cousin who'd gone missing before I was born. I left the library in a daze, my mind reeling. Had my uncle been involved in Sarah's disappearance? Had I inherited not just a farm, but a dark family secret? When I got home, there was a police car in the driveway. Detective Reeves, the lead investigator, was waiting for me. Mr. Collins, she said as I got out of my truck. We need to talk. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where I'd spent a sleepless night. Detective Reeves didn't waste time on pleasantries. We've identified the DNA on some of the items in the box, she said, her eyes boring into mine. It matches Sarah Milligan. We're treating this as a homicide investigation now. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Mr. Collins, I have to ask, did you know anything about this before you found that box? I shook my head vehemently. No, absolutely not. I inherited this farm from my uncle 6 months ago. I never even met him. She raised an eyebrow. Your uncle? I took a deep breath. James Milligan, Sarah's father. Detective Reeves leaned back, surprised. You're related to the Milligans? I explained what I'd learned at the library, about the connection I'd only just discovered. As I talked, I could see the wheels turning in the detective's mind. Mr. Collins, I'm going to be straight with you, she said when I finished. This complicates things. We're going to need to do a thorough search of the property, and I'm afraid you and your son might need to find somewhere else to stay for a while. I nodded, feeling numb. Of course, whatever you need. The next few weeks were a nightmare. The farm became a crime scene, with police and forensic teams combing every inch of the property. Jake and I moved into a motel in town, watching from afar as our new home was torn apart in search of evidence. The story hit the local news, then went national. Suddenly, our quiet little town was overrun with reporters and true crime enthusiasts. Everyone wanted to know about the mysterious box, about Sarah Milligan, about the farmer who'd inherited a decades-old secret. I tried to shield Jake from the worst of it, but it was impossible to hide everything. He was old enough to understand the basics of what was happening. and his initial excitement about solving a mystery had given way to a more somber understanding of the reality we were facing. It was Jake who asked the question I'd been avoiding. "Dad, do you think Uncle James did it? Do you think he killed Sarah?" I pulled him close, wishing I had a better answer. "I don't know, buddy. I really don't know." As the investigation dragged on, more details emerged. Old case files were reopened, witnesses re-interviewed. The picture that emerged was a sad one. Sarah had wanted to leave the farm, to start a life with her fiancé. James Milligan had opposed the marriage, wanting Sarah to stay and help run the family business. But there was no smoking gun, no confession, just a lot of circumstantial evidence and a family torn apart by secrets and suspicion. Finally, after nearly 2 months, we were allowed to return to the farm. The police had found no other evidence, and while the investigation remained open, they had no reason to keep us from our home. The farm felt different now. Every creaking floorboard, every rustle in the field, seemed to whisper of long-buried secrets. I found myself avoiding the spot where we'd found the box, as if Sarah's ghost might be lingering there. As we settled back into our routines, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were living in the shadow of a tragedy. The farm that was supposed to be our fresh start now felt tainted, haunted by the echoes of the past. But we stayed, partly because we had nowhere else to go, but also because it felt like we owed it to Sarah to uncover the truth, to bring her story to light after so many years of silence. I don't know if we'll ever know exactly what happened to Sarah Milligan, but I do know that her story and the secrets of this farm are now a part of our lives. And somehow, we'll find a way to live with that, to honor her memory while building our own future on this land. Every time I pick up a shovel now, I can't help but wonder what other secrets might be buried beneath our feet. And are some things better left undiscovered? Story 4. It's funny how I ended up here, in the middle of nowhere, doing something I swore I'd never do. You see, I've always been more of a city guy, the kind who enjoys the hum of traffic, the glow of street lights, and the comfort of knowing a bodega is just around the corner. My name is Arthur Melvin, and I was an investment banker, a workaholic who never took a break until I was forced to. The heart attack wasn't severe, but it was enough to make my doctor insist on time away from the office. So after some soul-searching and pressure from my family, I bought an RV and hit the road, determined to find peace in nature. I figured, why not try camping? Maybe it would do me some good. That's how I found myself in the deep woods of West Virginia, miles away from anything remotely civilized. The Monongahela National Forest, a name that was hard enough to pronounce, let alone appreciate. The forest was vast, dense, and eerily quiet, with only the sounds of nature to keep me company. At first, it was peaceful, almost therapeutic. The air was crisp, the trees were towering, and the sky, when visible through the canopy, was a deep blue I hadn't seen in years. I parked my RV at a secluded spot near a small stream, far enough from the usual campsites to avoid any intrusions. I wanted isolation, and I got it. The first day went by uneventfully. I hiked a bit, read a book, and tried my hand at fishing, unsuccessfully, of course. As the sun began to set, I made a small fire and cooked some canned beans. It was all very rustic, and I almost enjoyed it. Almost. Night fell quickly in the forest, and with it came a silence so profound that it felt oppressive, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring and your thoughts grow louder. I was just settling into my RV, preparing to call it a night, when I heard it, a rustling sound, faint but unmistakable, coming from the trees. At first, I dismissed it as a deer or some other harmless creature, but the sound grew closer, heavier, like something large was moving through the underbrush. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it into the darkness, but all I could see were shadows and the occasional glint of light reflecting off leaves. The rustling stopped, and I convinced myself it was nothing. I locked the RV door, checked it twice, and went to bed, feeling a bit silly for being spooked by the wilderness. The next day, I decided to hike a little farther from the campsite, maybe explore some of the less traveled trails. I packed a small bag, filled my water bottle, and set out, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling that had settled in my gut. The trail was barely visible, more of a suggestion than a path, winding through dense trees and over rocky terrain. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was absurd, of course. There was no one out here, no signs of other campers or hikers, just me in the forest. After about an hour of walking, I stumbled upon something odd. A clearing, circular and unnaturally perfect, as if the trees had been cut down deliberately to make space. In the center of the clearing was a stone structure, low to the ground and covered in moss. It looked ancient, like something out of a history book, maybe a forgotten altar or shrine. Curiosity got the better of me, and I approached it, noticing strange carvings on the stones, symbols I didn't recognize, etched deeply into the rock. I reached out to touch one, feeling the roughness of the stone under my fingers, when I heard it again. Only this time, it was accompanied by a low, rhythmic thumping, like something heavy was hitting the ground repeatedly. I turned around, expecting to see another hiker or maybe an animal, but there was nothing. The clearing was empty, save for the trees that encircled it like silent sentinels. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving me standing there, heart pounding, in a clearing that suddenly felt much less inviting. I decided to head back to the RV, quickening my pace, the sense of unease growing with every step. When I returned to the campsite, everything was as I had left it. The fire pit was cold, the RV untouched, but the feeling of being watched hadn't left me. If anything, it had intensified. I spent the rest of the day close to the RV, not wanting to venture out again. As dusk fell, I started a fire, hoping the flames would bring some comfort. They didn't. The night was darker than before, the shadows deeper, and the forest seemed to close in around me. I heard the rustling again, closer this time, and that same thumping noise. My mind raced, trying to rationalize it, but no explanation seemed to fit. I retreated into the RV, locking the door once more and checking all the windows. I had a small hunting knife with me, a last-minute purchase at a roadside shop, and I kept it close, feeling more ridiculous by the minute. But then the RV shook, not a slight tremor, but a forceful jolt, as if something had rammed into it. I froze, gripping the knife, waiting for another impact. It came seconds later, harder this time, accompanied by a screeching sound that made my blood run cold. I didn't dare look out the window. I didn't want to see what was out there, but I couldn't just sit there, waiting for whatever it was to break in. I had to do something. My mind raced through options, but none of them seemed feasible. Running into the woods was out of the question. I didn't even know what was out there. Staying in the RV felt like a death sentence. The creature, because that's what it had to be, a creature of some kind, was ramming the RV with increasing force, each impact causing the metal to groan and creak. In a burst of adrenaline, I threw open the RV door and bolted out, knife in hand, running in the direction of the clearing. I didn't know why I chose that direction. Maybe because it was the only place I knew, or maybe because some instinct told me to go there. The night was pitch black, the moon hidden behind thick clouds, and I could barely see where I was going. But I could hear it, the thumping, the rustling, the heavy breathing of whatever was chasing me. I reached the clearing, panting and desperate, and for a moment, everything was silent. The air was thick with tension, the kind that makes your skin crawl. Then, from the shadows, it emerged, a hulking figure covered in coarse, matted fur, standing on two legs like a man, but with a face that was all wrong. It was like a wolf, but its features were distorted, stretched and twisted into something grotesque. Its eyes, God, those eyes, were wide and wild, reflecting the faint light of the moon. As it stepped closer, I backed away, heart pounding, knife trembling in my hand. The creature snarled, a deep, guttural sound that reverberated through the clearing. I knew I couldn't fight it, not with just a knife, but there was nowhere to run. The creature lunged at me, moving with terrifying speed for something so large. I barely had time to react, slashing wildly with the knife as it came at me. The blade connected with something solid, and the creature let out a howl of pain, but it didn't stop. It knocked me to the ground, the force of its attack sending the knife flying out of my hand. I struggled, kicking and punching, anything to keep those jaws away from my throat. But it was too strong, its weight pinning me down as it snapped at me, its breath hot and foul against my face. In a last-ditch effort, I reached for a rock, smashing it against the creature's head with all the strength I could muster. It recoiled, stunned, and I took the opportunity to scramble away, grabbing the knife as I went. I don't know what came over me. Maybe it was the fear or the desperation, but I turned and charged at the creature, plunging the knife into its side. It let out another howl, thrashing violently, but I held on, driving the blade deeper. Blood, thick and dark, poured from the wound, covering my hands and the ground beneath us. The creature shuddered, its strength waning, and finally collapsed with a final, shuddering breath. I stood there, panting, covered in blood, staring at the lifeless body of the creature at my feet. For a moment, I couldn't believe it was over, that I had actually survived. The forest was silent again, the oppressive weight of the night lifting slightly. I stumbled back to the RV, knife still in hand, and sat down, my mind numb with shock. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the bloodstained knife, but eventually the sky began to lighten, the first rays of dawn breaking through the trees. I didn't feel relief, just an overwhelming sense of exhaustion. I knew I had to leave, to get out of this place before anything else happened. But first, I needed to make sure it was real, that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. I walked back to the clearing, half expecting the body to be gone, for the creature to have vanished like some nightmare. But it was there, massive and still, its fur matted with blood. In the light of day, it looked less monstrous, but no less terrifying. I knew I couldn't leave it there. I couldn't risk anyone else finding it, or worse, more of its kind coming for it. With trembling hands, I began the gruesome task of burying the creature. It took hours, digging a shallow grave with nothing but a small camping shovel and my bare hands. As I worked, my mind raced with questions. What was this thing? How long had it been out here? Were there more? I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stumbled into something much bigger than I could comprehend. The stone structure in the clearing, the strange symbols, they had to be connected to this creature somehow. But how? And why? As I covered the last of the creature with dirt, I made a decision. I couldn't just leave and pretend this never happened. I needed answers. I needed to understand what I had seen, what I had done. But I also knew I couldn't do it alone. I hiked back to my RV, my body aching from the night's ordeal and the morning's labor. I packed up quickly, eager to put some distance between myself and this clearing. But I didn't leave the forest. Instead, I drove to the nearest ranger station, my mind already forming a plan. The ranger on duty, a grizzled man named Frank, looked at me with concern as I stumbled in, still covered in dirt and dried blood. I must have been a sight. I told him I had been attacked by a bear, that I had managed to fight it off but was badly shaken. It wasn't entirely a lie, but I couldn't bring myself to tell the whole truth. Not yet. Frank called in a search party, insisting that they needed to find the bear before it hurt someone else. I led them to the clearing, my heart pounding with each step. But when we arrived, the grave was empty. The disturbed earth was the only evidence that anything had happened there at all. The rangers were confused but not suspicious. They assumed the bear had been wounded but not killed, and had dragged itself away. They set up cameras in the area, and warned me to stay out of the back country for a while. I nodded, feigning relief at their help, but inside, I was reeling. I didn't leave West Virginia. Instead, I checked into a small motel in the nearest town, determined to find out more about what I had experienced. I spent days in the local library, poring over old newspapers, local history books, and folklore collections. I searched for any mention of strange creatures, unexplained disappearances, or unusual stone structures in the forest. At first, I found nothing concrete, just vague legends and campfire stories. But then, buried in a dusty tome of local history, I found something. A photograph from the early 1900s, showing a group of loggers standing around a stone structure that looked eerily similar to the one I had seen in the clearing. The caption mentioned a curious old Indian relic found deep in the forest, but there was something off about the men in the photo. Their smiles seemed forced, their eyes haunted. One man, standing at the edge of the group, caught my attention. His face was blurred, as if he had moved during the exposure, but there was something about his posture, the way he seemed to be looking over his shoulder, that sent a chill down my spine. I dug deeper, cross-referencing names and dates. I discovered that several of the men in the photo had gone missing in the months following the picture's publication. The official reports cited workplace accidents, but the details were vague, the investigations cursory. As I delved further into the town's history, a pattern began to emerge. Every few decades, there would be a spate of disappearances or unusual animal attacks. The incidents were always explained away: bears, mountain lions, tragic accidents, but the timing was too consistent to be a coincidence. I reached out to a professor of anthropology at a nearby university, sharing some of what I had found under the guise of researching local folklore. He seemed intrigued by my questions about the stone structure and the symbols I had seen. "What you're describing," he said over the phone, his voice tinged with excitement, "sounds like it could be connected to some very old, very obscure Native American legends. There are stories of guardian spirits, creatures that protect sacred places. But these weren't always benevolent spirits. Some were said to be changed, corrupted." His words sent a shiver through me. I thanked him for his time and hung up, my mind racing. I was onto something, I was sure of it, but the more I uncovered, the more I realized how dangerous this knowledge could be. Weeks had passed since my encounter in the forest, but I couldn't let it go. The need for answers, for understanding, had become an obsession. I knew I had to go back. I had to see the clearing again, to examine the stone structure more closely. I waited for a clear night, when the moon was full. I told myself it was for better visibility, but deep down, I knew it was because I was afraid of what might be lurking in the darkness. I parked my car at the trailhead and set out, my backpack loaded with supplies, flashlights, extra batteries, a first aid kit, and my trusty hunting knife. The forest was different at night. Every shadow seemed to move, every rustle of leaves sounded like footsteps. But I pressed on, following the faint trail back to the clearing. When I arrived, my breath caught in my throat. The stone structure was still there, but it looked different in the moonlight. The symbols seemed to shimmer, as if they were alive. I approached cautiously, my flashlight beam dancing over the ancient stones. As I got closer, I realized what had changed. New symbols had been carved into the rock, crude and fresh compared to the weathered originals. With a jolt, I recognized one of them. It was the same shape as the wound I had inflicted on the creature. A twig snapped behind me, and I whirled around, my heart pounding. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood a figure. For a moment, I thought it was the creature again, back from the dead. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized it was a man, tall and lean, with long, matted hair and wild eyes. He stared at me, not with anger or aggression, but with a kind of desperate intensity. When he spoke, his voice was rough, as if unused to forming words. "You've seen it," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, unable to speak. He took a step forward, and I saw that his clothes were tattered, his skin covered in dirt and old scars. "Then you know," he continued. "You know that it's not over. That it's never over." "What do you mean?" I finally managed to ask. "What is this place? What was that thing?" The man laughed, a hollow, mirthless sound. "Thing? No, not a thing. A guardian. A protector. Or it was once." He trailed off, his eyes losing focus for a moment before snapping back to me. "Before we corrupted it," he finished. "We?" I asked, taking a step closer despite my fear. "Who are you? What do you know about this?" The man sighed, suddenly looking very old and very tired. "My name is Robert Carlyle. I was part of a research team that came here decades ago. We thought we'd found something revolutionary, an ancient site of immense power. We were fools." Robert's story poured out of him, as if he'd been waiting years to tell it. His team had discovered the clearing and the stone structure back in the 1980s. They were anthropologists and archaeologists, excited by the prospect of uncovering a previously unknown Native American site. "But it was so much more than that," Robert said, his voice trembling. "The symbols, the structure, they were a key, a lock. And we, in our arrogance, decided to open it. They had deciphered part of the symbols, enough to perform what they thought was an ancient ritual. But instead of revealing archaeological treasures, their actions had awakened something. The Guardian, as Robert called it, a creature bound to the site for centuries, tasked with protecting it from intruders. It wasn't evil, not at first," Robert explained. "But our presence, our meddling, it changed it, corrupted it, and then it started hunting." The story he told chilled me to the bone. The creature had decimated the research team, killing most and driving the rest into hiding or madness. Robert had been the only one to stay, feeling responsible for what they'd unleashed. "I've tried to stop it, to undo what we did," he said, gesturing to the new symbols on the stone. "But it's not enough. It's never enough." As Robert's tale came to an end, I stood there, trying to process everything I'd heard. It seemed impossible, like something out of a nightmare. But I had seen the creature with my own eyes, had fought it with my own hands. "What can we do?" I asked, surprising myself with the "we." But I knew I couldn't walk away from this, not now. Robert looked at me, a glimmer of hope in his tired eyes. "There might be a way," he said slowly. "The original ritual, we never completed it. We thought we had, but there was a part we missed, a final step." He explained that the ritual was meant to bind the Guardian to its purpose, to renew its connection to the land and its protective role. By interrupting it, they had severed that connection, leaving the creature unmoored and susceptible to corruption. "If we could complete the ritual," Robert said, "we might be able to restore the Guardian to its original purpose, or at least put it to rest." The plan was dangerous, bordering on insane. We would need to decipher the remaining symbols, gather the necessary components for the ritual, and somehow lure the creature back to the clearing, all while avoiding being killed by the very thing we were trying to save. But what choice did we have? I couldn't leave knowing that this creature was out there, that it might hurt more people. And Robert had been living with this guilt for decades. He deserved a chance to make things right. Over the next few weeks, Robert and I worked tirelessly to prepare for the ritual. We pored over his old notes, cross-referencing them with the books I'd found in the local library. Slowly, painfully, we began to piece together the final parts of the ritual. The components were difficult to gather. Some were simple, specific plants that grew in the forest, water from a particular stream. Others were more challenging, requiring us to dig deep into the earth near the stone structure, searching for buried artifacts. All the while, we were aware of the creature's presence. It never showed itself, but we could feel it watching us. The forest seemed to grow darker, the shadows deeper. More than once, I woke up in my tent, heart pounding, sure that I had heard the sound of heavy breathing just outside. Robert was convinced that the creature was aware of what we were doing. "It's afraid," he said one evening as we sat by the campfire. "It knows we're trying to change it, and it's afraid." I wasn't sure if that made me feel better or worse. Finally, after what felt like months, but was really only a few weeks, we were ready. We had deciphered the symbols, gathered the components, and steeled ourselves for what was to come. We chose to perform the ritual on the night of the new moon, when the forest would be at its darkest. As we made our way to the clearing, the air felt thick and heavy, like the forest itself was holding its breath. The stone structure seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy as we approached. We laid out our components, drew the necessary symbols on the ground with chalk and ash, and began the ritual. Robert took the lead, chanting words in a language I didn't understand. I followed his cues, adding my voice when needed, placing components in specific patterns around the stone. As the ritual progressed, the air began to change. It crackled with electricity, and I could have sworn I saw faint lights dancing between the trees. And then we heard it, the familiar sound of heavy footsteps drawing closer. The creature burst into the clearing with a roar that shook the trees. It was just as terrifying as I remembered, possibly more so. Its eyes blazed with a mixture of fury and fear as it charged towards us. Robert never faltered in his chanting, even as the creature bore down on us. I wanted to run, every instinct screaming at me to flee, but I held my ground. We were so close, we couldn't stop now. Just as the creature reached the edge of our ritual circle, something changed. The symbols we had drawn began to glow, a soft blue light that quickly intensified. The creature howled, but it sounded less like a roar of rage and more like a cry of pain. I watched in awe as the creature's form began to shift. The matted fur seemed to melt away, revealing something underneath that was both less and more than animal. It was as if I was seeing layers of time peeled back, revealing what the guardian had once been. Robert's chanting reached a crescendo, and suddenly, everything went silent. The glowing symbols flared brightly, then faded. The creature, the guardian, stood motionless in the center of our circle. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then, slowly, the guardian turned its gaze to us. The eyes that had once been filled with rage now held something else. Understanding, sadness, and perhaps a glimmer of gratitude. With a sound that was part sigh and part growl, the guardian's form began to dissolve. It was like watching mist evaporate in the morning sun. Within moments, it was gone, leaving behind nothing but a feeling of profound emptiness. Robert and I stood in the clearing, breathing heavily, scarcely able to believe what we had just witnessed. The forest around us felt different, lighter somehow, as if a great burden had been lifted. "Is it over?" I asked, my voice hoarse. Robert nodded slowly. "I think so," he said. "We've restored the balance. The guardian is at peace." As dawn broke over the forest, we began the task of clearing away the remnants of the ritual. We worked in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. I knew that I would never be the same after this experience. The world was bigger, stranger, and more dangerous than I had ever imagined. But it was also more wondrous. As we prepared to leave the clearing for the last time, Robert turned to me. "Thank you," he said simply. "I couldn't have done this alone." I nodded, understanding the weight of those words. "What will you do now?" I asked. He looked around the clearing, a small smile on his face. "I think my work here is done," he said. "It's time for me to rejoin the world." As for me, I knew I couldn't go back to my old life, not completely. The forest had changed me, shown me things I could never unsee. But I didn't regret it. I left the Monongahela National Forest with a newfound respect for the mysteries of the world and a determination to keep my eyes open to the wonders and dangers that might be lurking just out of sight. As I drove away, I couldn't help but glance in my rearview mirror. The forest receded behind me, its secrets once again hidden beneath the canopy of ancient trees. But I knew they were there, and I knew that somewhere in the deepest part of the woods, a guardian rested, its vigil finally complete. Story 5. Whatever you do, don't be here at midnight. The words were whispered with such urgency, such raw fear, that I felt my blood turn to ice. The weathered trucker who'd spoken them was already walking away, leaving me frozen in my seat, half-eaten burger growing cold on the plate in front of me. I glanced at my watch, 11:37 p.m. As I looked around the diner, taking in the tense faces and furtive glances of the other patrons, I realized with growing dread that I'd stumbled into something far more sinister than a late-night pit stop. My name's Jack, and until that moment, I'd been on a routine cross-country drive from New York to Los Angeles. I'm a freelance photographer, and I'd taken on a last-minute gig that required me to transport some sensitive equipment that couldn't be trusted to shipping companies. The pay was good, and I figured the road trip would give me a chance to capture some interesting shots along the way. I'd been driving for nearly 18 hours straight, fueled by gas station coffee and the kind of determination that only comes from a looming deadline, when I saw the neon sign for Mel's Diner, glowing like a beacon in the dark Nevada desert. I decided to pull over. My stomach was growling, and I figured a hot meal and a real cup of coffee would do me good. The diner looked like something straight out of a 1950s postcard, all chrome and red vinyl booths, with a jukebox in the corner playing old rock and roll tunes. But as soon as I walked in, I sensed something was off. The place was surprisingly busy for the middle of the night, but the atmosphere was tense, almost electric. I slid into an empty booth and ordered a cheeseburger and coffee from a waitress whose smile seemed a little too forced. As I waited for my food, I couldn't help but notice how everyone in the diner seemed on edge. Conversations were hushed, and people kept glancing at the large clock above the counter. When my food arrived, I tried to strike up a conversation with the waitress. "Busy night, huh?" She nodded, her eyes darting to the clock. "Yeah, it usually is around this time." "Oh, you get a lot of late-night traffic?" She hesitated, then leaned in closer. "Look, honey, you seem nice, so let me give you some advice. Eat quick and get back on the road. You don't want to be here too long." Before I could ask what she meant, she was gone, hurrying off to another table. I sat there, burger halfway to my mouth, thoroughly confused. That's when the trucker at the counter turned to me and whispered those chilling words. "Whatever you do, don't be here at midnight." As he walked away, I noticed other patrons starting to leave. They moved with an urgency that seemed at odds with the late hour, practically running to their vehicles. I flagged down my waitress again. "What's going on? Why is everyone leaving?" She glanced nervously at the clock, 11:45 p.m. now, and sighed. "I shouldn't tell you this, but things happen here at midnight. Bad things. Nobody knows why, but it's been going on for years. Some say this place sits on some kind of convergence, a weak spot between worlds. All I know is, you don't want to be here when the clock strikes 12. I laughed, though it sounded hollow even to my own ears. "Come on, you can't be serious. What is this place, haunted or something?" Her expression remained deadly serious. "Worse. Now please, for your own sake, finish up and go." I wanted to believe it was all an elaborate joke, some weird local custom to scare tourists. But the fear in her eyes, the palpable tension in the air, it felt too real to dismiss. I gulped down my coffee and threw some bills on the table, deciding that whatever was going on, I didn't want to stick around to find out. But as I stood up to leave, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. The door to the diner was gone. Where the entrance had been was now just a solid wall, covered in the same tacky wallpaper as the rest of the place. I blinked hard, convinced I must be more tired than I thought. But when I opened my eyes, the wall was still there. "It's starting," someone whispered. I turned to see the other remaining patrons, about a dozen in total, huddled together in the center of the diner. The waitress was among them, her earlier composure crumbling as she clutched a coffee pot like a weapon. "What's starting? What the hell is going on here?" I demanded, panic rising in my throat. An old man with a face like weathered leather spoke up. "It's midnight, son, or it will be in about..." He checked his watch. 2 minutes. "That's when they come." "Who comes? What are you talking about?" But before anyone could answer, the lights began to flicker. The jukebox, which had been quietly playing Great Balls of Fire, suddenly switched to a slow, discordant melody I didn't recognize. The temperature in the diner seemed to drop several degrees in a matter of seconds. "Circle up," the old man shouted. "Remember, don't look directly at them. And whatever you do, don't let them touch you." The group formed a tight circle, facing outward. Without thinking, I joined them, my back pressing against strangers as we huddled together. The waitress pressed something into my hand, a salt shaker. "Salt and iron," she muttered. "Only things that slow them down." I wanted to laugh, to tell them all this was insane. But the words died in my throat as I saw something moving outside the windows. Shapes darker than the night itself, flowing like smoke but with a terrible purpose to their movement. They pressed against the glass, which began to frost over despite the desert heat. And then, as the clock struck midnight, the real horror began. The shapes outside seemed to coalesce, forming vaguely humanoid figures that were somehow more terrifying for their almost recognizable form. They oozed through the cracks around the windows, seeping into the diner like a noxious gas. Someone in our group whimpered. I felt a hand grasp mine and squeeze tight. The old man's voice rose in a chant, words in a language I didn't understand. Others joined in, their voices shaking but growing stronger as they repeated the phrases. The shadow figures circled us, their movements jerky and unnatural. I caught glimpses of limbs that were too long, of faces that shifted and changed like smoke. The air grew thick with the smell of ozone and something rotten. One of the creatures reached out towards our group. Without thinking, I flung the contents of my salt shaker at it. The thing recoiled with a hiss that sounded like radio static, its form dissipating for a moment before reforming. Time seemed to stretch and distort. I couldn't tell if we'd been surrounded for minutes or hours. My arm ached from holding it out, salt shaker at the ready. My throat was raw from chanting words I didn't understand. Just when I thought I couldn't take any more, when the press of bodies and the suffocating presence of the shadow creatures became too much, something changed. The old man's chanting reached a fever pitch, and suddenly, the air itself seemed to ripple. The shadow figures began to retreat, their forms becoming less distinct. They flowed back out through the windows, which shattered outward in a spray of glass. A wind whipped through the diner, carrying with it the last wisps of the creatures and the lingering smell of decay. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. We stood there in stunned silence for a long moment, the only sound our ragged breathing and the crunch of broken glass underfoot. Slowly, our circle broke apart. I saw tears on some faces, blank shock on others. The waitress was the first to speak. "Everyone okay? Anyone touched?" There was a general murmur of assent. No one, it seemed, had been injured, physically at least. As if a spell had been broken, the diner burst into activity. People began sweeping up glass, righting overturned chairs, trying to restore some semblance of normalcy. I stood there, salt shaker still clutched in my hand, trying to process what I'd just experienced. The old man approached me, his eyes kind but weary. "First time, huh? You did good, son." I found my voice at last. What were those things? Why here? Why at midnight?" He shook his head. "Wish I could tell you. Been coming here every night for 30 years, trying to figure it out. All I know is they're getting stronger. And if we weren't here to hold them back." He trailed off, his implication clear. As the sun began to rise, painting the desert in shades of pink and gold, the door to the diner reappeared. People began to leave, nodding to each other with the camaraderie of soldiers who'd been through battle together. I made my way to my car on shaky legs, my mind still reeling. As I was about to drive away, the waitress ran out, pressing a piece of paper into my hand. "If you're ever passing through again," she said, "and you want to help, this is where we'll be." I looked down at the paper. It was a schedule listing dates and times, a roster of guardians keeping watch against the darkness. As I pulled back onto the highway, the events of the night began to feel like a dream. But the salt shaker on my passenger seat and the paper clutched in my hand were undeniable proof of what I'd experienced. I don't know if I'll ever go back to that diner. Part of me hopes I never see it again. But another part, a part I'm still coming to terms with, knows that I will. Because now that I've seen what's out there, now that I know what lurks in the spaces between moments, how can I not stand against it? So if you're ever driving through the Nevada desert late at night, and you see a diner glowing like a beacon in the darkness, think carefully before you stop. And if you do, keep an eye on the clock. Because when midnight comes, you might find yourself facing horrors beyond imagination, or standing shoulder to shoulder with strangers, the last line of defense against the encroaching dark. And whatever you do, don't be there at midnight. Unless, of course, you choose to be. Story 6. The headlights appeared out of nowhere, twin beams cutting through the darkness behind me. I squinted at the rearview mirror, my grip tightening on the steering wheel. Where had this truck come from? The highway had been empty for miles. It was well past midnight, and I was on the final stretch of a grueling cross-country drive. My eyelids felt like sandpaper, and the endless ribbon of asphalt ahead blurred into a hypnotic streak. I'd been pushing myself to make it home before dawn, but now, with this truck bearing down on me, I was wide awake. The cab loomed large in my mirror, impossibly close. I tapped my brakes, hoping the driver would take the hint and back off. No luck. If anything, it seemed to inch even closer. "Come on, just pass me already," I muttered, easing over to the right lane. The truck matched my move perfectly, staying right on my tail. I could practically count the rivets on its grille. My heart started to race. This wasn't normal behavior, even for the most impatient driver. I pressed down on the accelerator, watching the speedometer climb, 70, 75, 80 miles per hour. The truck kept pace effortlessly, never falling behind. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I was alone on a deserted highway with a truck that seemed determined to run me off the road. My mind raced through possible explanations, each more unsettling than the last. Road rage, a drunk driver, or something worse. I spotted a sign for an upcoming rest stop and made a split-second decision. I'd pull in there, where there might be other people around. Safety in numbers, right? As I took the exit, the truck followed. I cursed under my breath, hands shaking as I navigated the dark, twisting road leading to the rest area. The parking lot came into view, illuminated by a single flickering streetlight. It was empty. I pulled into a spot near the restroom building, killing the engine. The truck's headlights flooded my rearview mirror, blinding me. I squeezed my eyes shut, heart pounding in my ears. This was it. Whatever was going to happen would happen now. Seconds ticked by. Then silence. The light behind me vanished. Slowly, I opened my eyes and turned around. The parking lot was empty. No truck, no headlights. Nothing but darkness and the faint buzz of the streetlight above. I sat there frozen for what felt like hours. My mind struggled to process what had just happened. Had I imagined it all? Was I so exhausted that I'd hallucinated a threatening truck? Eventually, I gathered the courage to step out of my car. The cool night air hit my face, helping to clear my head. I walked a lap around the parking lot, half expecting the truck to reappear at any moment. But there was no sign it had ever been there. As the adrenaline began to fade, exhaustion crept back in. I decided to try to get some sleep in my car before continuing my journey. I reclined the seat and closed my eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time I started to drift off, I'd jerk awake, certain I'd heard the rumble of an engine. The sky was just beginning to lighten when I gave up on sleep. I needed coffee if I was going to make it the rest of the way home. I started the car and pulled out of the rest stop, constantly checking my mirrors for any sign of the truck. The highway was still eerily empty as I merged back onto it. My nerves were shot, and every vehicle I saw in the distance made my heart rate spike. But none of them were the truck that had chased me. About an hour later, I spotted a 24-hour diner just off the highway. The parking lot was half full, a welcome sight after the emptiness of the night. I pulled in, desperate for caffeine and human contact. The bell above the door jingled as I entered. A few heads turned to look at me, then went back to their own conversations or plates of food. I slid into a booth near the window, still able to keep an eye on my car and the highway beyond. A waitress approached, coffee pot in hand. "Rough night?" she asked, eyeing my disheveled appearance as she filled my cup. I nodded, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. "You could say that. Had a bit of a scare on the highway." She raised an eyebrow. "Oh, what happened?" I hesitated, suddenly feeling foolish. How could I explain what I'd experienced without sounding crazy? "There was this truck," I began. "It followed me for miles, riding my bumper. When I pulled over at a rest stop, it just vanished." The waitress's expression changed, a flicker of recognition in her eyes. She glanced around, then leaned in closer. "You're not the first to come through here with a story like that," she said in a low voice. My blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" She sighed, sliding into the seat across from me. "In the past few months, we've had a handful of drivers stop in here, all shaken up about a truck that chased them on the highway. Always at night, always on that same stretch you came in on." I leaned forward, hanging on her every word. "Did they see who was driving it?" She shook her head. "That's the thing. No one ever sees a driver. And the truck always disappears without a trace." A chill ran down my spine. "What do you think it means?" The waitress shrugged, but her eyes were serious. "I don't know, but there's been a string of robberies on that highway lately. Cars found abandoned, drivers missing. Police haven't been able to catch whoever's behind it." My mind reeled, trying to connect the dots. A phantom truck, disappearing drivers, unsolved robberies. It was like something out of a nightmare. Has anyone reported this truck to the police? I asked. She nodded. A few have tried, but without any evidence and with the truck always vanishing. Well, let's just say the police aren't taking it too seriously. I sat back, processing this information. Part of me felt relieved that I wasn't the only one who had experienced this, that I wasn't going crazy. But a larger part was terrified. What was really going on out there on that lonely stretch of highway? The waitress must have seen the fear in my eyes. She reached out and patted my hand. Look, you made it here safe. That's what matters. My advice? Stick to driving during the day if you can. And if you see that truck again, get somewhere public as fast as you can. I nodded, grateful for her kindness and the warning. As she stood to get back to work, a thought occurred to me. Wait, I called after her. You said there have been robberies, missing drivers, but I wasn't robbed. The truck didn't even stop when I pulled over. Why? She turned back, a grim expression on her face. Maybe you got lucky. Or maybe they were just scouting. Learning your habits, your reactions. For next time. With that chilling thought, she walked away, leaving me alone with my cooling coffee and racing thoughts. I stayed at the diner far longer than I'd planned, nursing cup after cup of coffee as I watched the sunrise fully. The normality of the morning rush helped ground me, reminding me that the world wasn't all dark highways and phantom trucks. When I finally got back on the road, I felt more in control. The highway looked different in the daylight, less menacing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that somewhere out there, the driver of that ghost truck was waiting for another opportunity. I made it home without further incident, but the experience stayed with me. I found myself researching highway robberies in the area, looking for patterns or clues. I even considered reporting my experience to the police, but always stopped short. What could I tell them that wouldn't sound completely insane? Weeks passed, and slowly, the intensity of that night began to fade. I still avoided driving that stretch of highway after dark, but the constant fear subsided. Life went on. Then, about a month after my encounter, I saw a news report that made my blood run cold. A car had been found abandoned on that same highway. The driver was missing. Witnesses reported seeing a large truck in the area just before the disappearance. As I stared at the TV screen, a chill ran down my spine. I couldn't help but wonder, had I really escaped that night, or had I just postponed the inevitable? The highway stretched out before me, a dark ribbon cutting through the night. But now, every set of headlights in my rearview mirror made me flinch. Every truck that passed sent my heart racing. The once peaceful solitude of a late-night drive had been shattered, replaced by a constant, gnawing fear. I knew one thing for certain. I would never look at an empty highway the same way again. Because now I knew that sometimes, in the dead of night, those highways aren't as empty as they seem. And the things that lurk in the darkness don't always disappear when you turn to face them. Story 7. The leather-bound journal fell open in my hands, its yellowed pages releasing a musty cloud of dust and decay. At first, I thought it was just another relic of the farm's long history, maybe a record of crop yields or livestock lineages. But as my eyes skimmed the faded, spidery handwriting, my heart began to race. This was no ordinary farm ledger. The words human subject and genetic manipulation leapt out at me, and I realized with growing horror that I'd stumbled upon something far darker than I could have imagined. Little did I know, this discovery would plunge me into a nightmare that would make me question everything I thought I knew about the quiet, rural world around me. My name's Sam, and I'd only been working at Willow Creek Farm for about a month when I found the journal. Fresh out of college with an agriculture degree and dreams of someday owning my own farm, I jumped at the chance to work as a farmhand for old Mr. Harrison. The pay wasn't great, but the experience was invaluable, and there was something charming about the sprawling, slightly run-down property with its weathered barns and endless fields. Mr. Harrison was a quiet man, gruff but fair. He lived alone in the big farmhouse, his wife long dead, and his children moved away to the city. He didn't talk much about the farm's history, just gave me my daily tasks and left me to it. I spent my days mending fences, tending to the small herd of cattle, and helping to plant and harvest the crops. It was a hot, sticky afternoon in late July when Mr. Harrison asked me to clear out one of the old barns. "Been meaning to do it for years," he'd grumbled. "Might as well put you to use on it. Just pile up anything that looks worth keeping, haul the rest to the burn pile." The barn was a cavernous structure, its interior dim and cool compared to the sweltering heat outside. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that streamed through gaps in the weathered boards. The air was thick with the smell of old hay, and something else, something chemical that I couldn't quite place. I started in one corner, sorting through piles of rusted farm equipment, moldering sacks of feed, and broken furniture. It was monotonous work, and my mind wandered as I hauled item after item to the growing pile outside. That's when I noticed the loose floorboard. I might have missed it entirely if my boot hadn't caught on the edge, nearly sending me sprawling. Curious, I knelt down to examine it. The board shifted easily under my hands, and as I lifted it, I saw a small space underneath, just big enough to hide something. The journal was wrapped in oilcloth, surprisingly well preserved considering its hiding place. I pulled it out, glancing over my shoulder guiltily. Though I knew Mr. Harrison was off in the fields, it felt invasive reading someone else's private thoughts. But my curiosity got the better of me. As I began to read, that curiosity quickly turned to confusion, then to horror. The journal belonged to a Dr. Elliot Harrison, dated 1954. Mr. Harrison's father, I realized. But this was no ordinary farmer. The pages detailed complex scientific experiments, far beyond anything I'd learned in my agriculture courses. Dr. Harrison wrote about his attempts to create hardier, more productive livestock through genetic manipulation. But it wasn't just animals he was experimenting on. There were detailed notes about human subjects, vague references to volunteers from the local asylum. My hands shook as I turned the pages, descriptions of failed experiments, of creatures that were neither fully human nor fully animal, sketches that turned my stomach. And throughout it all, a growing sense of the doctor's obsession, his conviction that he was on the verge of a breakthrough that would revolutionize agriculture and change the world. The final entry, dated 1963, was different. The handwriting was shaky, almost frantic. It's done. The experiment was a success, but at what cost? They're out there now, hiding in the woods, in the fields. I can hear them at night, scratching at the walls. God forgive me for what I've created. I snapped the journal shut, my heart pounding. This had to be some kind of sick joke, right? Or maybe the ramblings of a madman. There was no way any of this could be real. But even as I tried to rationalize it, memories of odd occurrences around the farm began to surface. The strange noises I'd heard at night, dismissed as wildlife, the areas of the property Mr. Harrison had warned me to avoid, the way the cattle sometimes seemed spooked by something I couldn't see. I shoved the journal back into its hiding place, my mind reeling. I needed to get out of this barn, to get some fresh air and clear my head. As I stepped outside, blinking in the harsh sunlight, I nearly ran into Mr. Harrison. "Making progress?" he asked, eyeing the pile of junk I'd accumulated. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Did he know about the journal? About what his father had done? Mr. Harrison's eyes narrowed slightly, as if sensing my unease. "Everything all right, Sam? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I'm fine," I managed to say. "Just, it's hot in there. Needed some air." He nodded slowly. "Well, don't work too hard. Come on up to the house when you're done. I'll fix us some dinner." I watched him walk away, trying to reconcile the kind, gruff old man I knew with the dark history I'd just uncovered. Was he continuing his father's work? Or was he just as much a victim of it as anyone else? That night, as I lay in bed in the small apartment above the garage that Mr. Harrison had given me, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the old building, every rustle from the fields outside, set my nerves on edge. I kept thinking about the journal, about the creatures Dr. Harrison had written about. Were they still out there after all these years? A sudden noise outside my window made me bolt upright. It was a strange, guttural sound, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. My heart pounding, I crept to the window and peered out into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing, but then movement caught my eye. Something was moving in the field beyond the barn, something large and definitely not a cow. Its movements were jerky, unnatural. And then it turned, and I caught a glimpse of its face in the moonlight. I stumbled back from the window, biting back a scream. What I'd seen, it wasn't human, but it wasn't fully animal either. It was something in between, something that should not exist. I spent the rest of the night huddled in my bed, every muscle tense, listening to the sounds of movement outside. When dawn finally broke, I was exhausted but relieved. Surely, in the light of day, everything would make sense again. But as the days passed, strange occurrences began to multiply. Tools would go missing, only to turn up in odd places. The cattle grew increasingly agitated, especially at night. And more than once, I caught Mr. Harrison staring off into the woods with a troubled expression. I thought about leaving, about packing up my things and getting as far away from Willow Creek Farm as I could. But something held me back. Curiosity, maybe, or a sense of responsibility. Whatever Dr. Harrison had done, whatever he'd created, it was still out there. And maybe, just maybe, there was something I could do about it. I began my own investigations, carefully at first. I reread the journal, making notes, trying to understand the science behind Dr. Harrison's experiments. I explored the far reaches of the property, areas Mr. Harrison had told me to avoid, looking for signs of the creatures. And slowly, I started to piece together the truth. The experiments hadn't ended with Dr. Harrison's last journal entry. They'd continued, passed down from father to son. Mr. Harrison wasn't just aware of what his father had done, he was trying to fix it. It all came to a head one stormy night in late August. I was awakened by the sound of breaking glass and Mr. Harrison's shouts. I raced to the farmhouse, rain lashing at my face, to find the front door splintered and hanging off its hinges. Inside, the scene was chaos. Furniture overturned, claw marks scoring the wall. And there, in the center of the living room, stood Mr. Harrison, facing off against a creature that defied description. Part human, part animal, its body a patchwork of mismatched parts, its eyes glowing with an unnatural intelligence. "Sam!" Mr. Harrison yelled when he saw me. "The syringe! On the mantel!" I saw it then, a large syringe filled with a glowing blue liquid. Without thinking, I grabbed it and tossed it to Mr. Harrison. In one smooth motion, he caught it and plunged it into the creature's neck. The thing let out a howl that made my blood run cold. It thrashed wildly for a moment, then collapsed to the floor, its body seeming to melt and reform before my eyes. In moments, all that was left was an unconscious, very human-looking man. Mr. Harrison sank to his knees, his face a mask of exhaustion and relief. "It's over," he murmured. "It's finally over." In the days that followed, Mr. Harrison told me everything. How his father's experiments had created a handful of hybrid creatures. How they'd hidden in the woods for decades, occasionally venturing out to terrorize the farm. How he'd spent his life trying to find a cure, a way to reverse what his father had done. The man we'd captured that night was the last of them. With him cured, the long nightmare was finally over. But the weight of it, the dark legacy of Willow Creek Farm, would stay with me forever. I still worked the farm with Mr. Harrison. We never spoke of that night to anyone else, who would believe us. But sometimes, on quiet nights, when the wind whispers through the cornfields, I find myself scanning the tree line, wondering if we truly found them all. And I can't help but think about the thin line between scientific progress and playing God, and how easy it is to cross that line with the best of intentions. The secrets of Willow Creek Farm are buried now, as they should be. But the lessons, about responsibility, about the unforeseen consequences of our actions, those will stay with me always. And I'll never look at a quiet, rural farm quite the same way again. Story 8. The footprints ended abruptly in the middle of the field, as if their owner had simply vanished into thin air. I stood there, flashlight in hand, my mind struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. 20 years on the force, and I'd never encountered anything like this. The car was still running, keys in the ignition, the driver's personal belongings untouched. It was as if the driver had stepped out for a moment and just disappeared. Little did I know, this seemingly routine call would lead me down a rabbit hole of inexplicable events and unsolved mysteries that would haunt me for years to come. My name's Sarah Jennings, and I've been a state trooper in Nevada for 2 decades. I thought I'd seen it all: high-speed chases, horrific accidents, even the occasional UFO report from some poor soul who'd been out in the desert heat too long. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night on a lonely stretch of Highway 50, deep in the heart of what locals call the loneliest road in America. It started as a typical night shift. I was cruising along the highway, more tumbleweeds than traffic keeping me company, when the call came in. A passing motorist had reported an abandoned vehicle on the side of the road, hazard lights blinking. Standard procedure. I'd check it out, call a tow if necessary, and be on my way. As I pulled up behind the vehicle, a late-model sedan, nothing remarkable about it, I noticed something odd. The engine was still running. I approached cautiously, one hand on my holster out of habit. The driver's side door was slightly ajar, but there was no sign of the driver. I shone my flashlight into the interior. Everything looked normal: a half-empty water bottle in the cup holder, a phone charging on the dashboard, a duffel bag in the back seat. No signs of a struggle, no blood, nothing to indicate foul play. "Hello," I called out, sweeping my flashlight across the surrounding area. Anyone there? Highway patrol. Only the whisper of the desert wind answered me. That's when I noticed the footprints. A single set, leading away from the driver's side door into the field adjacent to the highway. They were clear and purposeful, not the staggering tracks of someone injured or disoriented. I radioed in my situation and began to follow the prints. The field was mostly bare scrub brush and hard-packed earth, easy to see the trail in the beam of my flashlight. I expected to find the driver relieving themselves behind a bush, or maybe having wandered off in confusion. Instead, I found nothing. The footprints stopped abruptly about 50 yards into the field. One moment they were there, clear as day, and the next nothing. Just undisturbed earth stretching out into the darkness. I stood there for a long moment, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. People don't just vanish. There had to be an explanation. I searched the area thoroughly, widening my circle, looking for any sign of disturbance. Nothing. No scuff marks to indicate someone had jumped or been lifted, no signs of a struggle. Just those footprints, ending in the middle of nowhere. By the time backup arrived, I was sweating despite the cool night air. My colleague, Mike, took one look at my face and knew something was off. "What have we got, Sarah?" he asked, his hand instinctively moving to his holster. I explained the situation, showing him the car, the footprints, the impossible ending. He followed me out into the field, his own bewilderment growing with each step. "This is weird," he said finally, standing at the end of the trail. "Really weird. We called in forensics, had the area cordoned off. The next few hours were a blur of activity. Photographing the scene, taking casts of the footprints, searching the vehicle. The driver was identified as one David Chun, 37, a software engineer from San Francisco. His family was contacted. No, they hadn't heard from him. Yes, he was driving to visit them in Denver. No, he had no history of mental illness or erratic behavior. As dawn broke, casting long shadows across the field, we were no closer to an explanation. David Chun had simply vanished, leaving behind a running car and a set of footprints that led nowhere. In the days that followed, the investigation intensified. Search parties combed the area, helicopters with thermal imaging scanned for miles around. David's phone records, bank statements, and internet history were scrutinized. Missing persons bulletins were issued across multiple states. Nothing, not a single clue as to what had happened to David Chin. Theories abounded, each more outlandish than the last. Some suggested he'd been abducted, by criminals, by a cult, by aliens. Others proposed he'd staged his own disappearance. There was talk of secret government experiments, of portals to other dimensions. I tried to stay grounded, to focus on the facts, but the more I dug into the case, the stranger things became. A week after David's disappearance, I received an anonymous tip. The caller, a trembling voice disguised by some kind of modulator, told me to look into something called the Highway of Tears. At first, I dismissed it as another crackpot lead, but something about the caller's urgency stuck with me. That night, unable to sleep, I started researching. What I found chilled me to the bone. The Highway of Tears, it turned out, wasn't just one highway. It was a phenomenon reported across multiple states, even multiple countries. Lonely stretches of road where people had vanished without a trace, often leaving behind vehicles in perfect working order. In some cases, there were reports of strange lights in the sky. In others, witnesses described a feeling of lost time, of the world around them seeming to shift and change. The deeper I dug, the more cases I found that mirrored David's. A woman in Alaska whose car was found running, her purse still on the seat, footprints leading into the snow before suddenly stopping. A truck driver in Australia who vanished while making a routine delivery, his rig discovered idling on the side of the outback highway. I began to compile a file, cross-referencing cases, looking for patterns. Most of the disappearances happened at night. Many occurred in remote areas. In several cases, witnesses reported electronic malfunctions, radios cutting out, phones losing signal, just before the disappearances. As my off-duty hours became consumed by this research, I could feel myself changing. I became jumpy, paranoid. Every time I patrolled that stretch of Highway 50, I found myself scanning the horizon, half expecting to see strange lights or shadowy figures. My colleagues noticed the change. Mike confronted me about it one night over coffee at the station. "Sarah, you've got to let this go," he said, his eyes full of concern. "The Chun case is cold. It's eating you up." I wanted to tell him everything, about the Highway of Tears, about the patterns I'd discovered, but I knew how it would sound. I'd be taken off active duty, sent for a psych eval. So I nodded, promised to take some time off, to get my head straight. But I couldn't let it go. The next night, I found myself back on Highway 50 off duty, my personal vehicle loaded with cameras and scanning equipment I'd borrowed from a friend in the UFO watching community. I don't know what I expected to find. Proof, maybe. Something to make sense of the senseless, to explain the inexplicable. What I got was something else entirely. It was just after midnight when my radio started to crackle with static. At first, I thought nothing of it. Reception was spotty out here at the best of times. But then I noticed the lights on my dashboard flickering. My headlights dimmed, then brightened, then dimmed again. Heart pounding, I pulled over to the side of the road. This was it, the electronic interference reported in other cases. I grabbed my camera, ready to document whatever came next. That's when I saw it, a light in the field beside the highway. Not a flashlight or a vehicle headlight, but something different. It pulsed with a soft, bluish glow, hovering about 6 feet off the ground. I stepped out of my car, camera forgotten in my hand. The light seemed to beckon to me, pulling me forward. I took one step, then another. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a voice was screaming at me to stop, to get back in the car, to drive away as fast as I could. But it was drowned out by an overwhelming sense of curiosity, of longing. I had to know what the light was, had to understand. I don't know how long I walked. Time seemed to lose all meaning. The light stayed just ahead of me, always just out of reach. I was vaguely aware of my feet moving, of the brush scraping against my legs. And then suddenly the light was gone. I blinked, disoriented, the spell broken. I found myself standing in the middle of the field, no idea how far I'd come. I turned back toward the highway, expecting to see my car's headlights. There was nothing. No car, no highway. Just empty desert stretching out in all directions, silvered by the light of a moon I didn't remember seeing earlier. Panic set in. I spun around, trying to get my bearings. That's when I saw them. Footprints in the dirt. My footprints leading to where I stood. And beyond them, another set of prints, familiar prints that I'd seen once before, ending abruptly in the middle of nowhere. I stood there, my mind reeling, as the full weight of my situation crashed down upon me. I understood now. I was no longer the investigator. I had become part of the mystery. As the first light of dawn began to creep across the horizon, I made a decision. I would follow those footprints, David Chen's footprints. Whatever had happened to him, whatever lay beyond that impossible ending, I would find out. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for whatever came next. Then I stepped forward, leaving my own trail of footprints in the desert sand. Somewhere out there, in the vast emptiness of the Nevada desert, there's an abandoned car with its engine still running and a set of footprints leading nowhere. The highway of tears had claimed another victim. And I had become just another unsolved mystery on the loneliest road in America. Story 9. I never thought I'd be the kind of person to believe in monsters. After 10 years as an emergency room nurse at St. Alphonsus Regional Medical Center in Boise, I thought I'd seen it all. Gunshot wounds, car crash victims, overdoses, the worst of humanity's frailties paraded before me on a nightly basis. My name is Alden Gable, and I've always prided myself on being a rational, level-headed guy. But what happened to me in the Clearwater National Forest shook my beliefs to the core and left me questioning everything I thought I knew about the world. It was the summer of 2023, and I'd been feeling the weight of my job more than ever. The past few years had been brutal, with the pandemic stretching our resources to the breaking point. Even as things slowly returned to normal, the toll on healthcare workers like myself was immense. I'd watched colleagues burn out, some leaving the profession altogether. I was determined not to be one of them, but I knew I needed a break, a real one, away from the constant beeping of machines and the smell of antiseptic. That's when I decided to take a month off and go camping. Not just any camping, mind you. I wanted complete isolation, a chance to decompress and reconnect with nature. I'd always been drawn to solitude, finding peace in quiet moments between the chaos of the ER. So, I rented an RV, packed it with supplies, and set my sights on the remote wilderness of northern Idaho. As I left Boise behind, driving north on Highway 55, I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders. The cityscape gradually gave way to rolling hills, then to the rugged mountains of the Payette National Forest. I stopped for lunch in the small town of McCall, sitting by the serene waters of Payette Lake. It was there, over a plate of fresh trout at a local diner, that I overheard a conversation that should have been my first warning. Two older men, weathered faces suggesting years of outdoor living, were talking in hushed tones about something they'd seen deep in the Clearwater forest. "It wasn't no bear, Tom," one of them insisted, his voice a gravelly whisper. "Bears don't move like that, and they sure as hell don't stand that tall." His companion shushed him, glancing around nervously before replying. "Keep your voice down, Bill. You know how people talk. We don't need another round of hunters coming up here chasing shadows." I should have paid more attention, should have asked them what they meant. But I was too focused on my own need for escape, too certain in my disbelief of anything supernatural. I chalked it up to local folklore, the kind of stories small towns thrive on to attract tourists and add a bit of mystery to their surroundings. As I continued north, the roads became narrower, the towns fewer and farther between. By late afternoon, I was deep in the Clearwater National Forest, following a winding logging road that hadn't seen maintenance in years. The RV groaned as it navigated the rough terrain, but I pressed on, determined to find the perfect spot, far from any hint of civilization. Just as the sun was beginning to dip below the tree line, I found it. A small clearing, barely visible from the overgrown road, beckoned me. I carefully maneuvered the RV into the space, the vehicle's bulk barely fitting between the towering pines. As I stepped out, the scent of pine and damp earth filled my nostrils. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and insects, a symphony of nature that instantly soothed my frayed nerves. I took a deep breath, savoring the clean, crisp air. This was exactly what I needed. No cell service, no people, just me and the great outdoors. As I began to set up camp, I felt the last vestiges of stress from my job melting away. I was ready for peace, for quiet contemplation. I had no idea that in just a few short days, this idyllic forest would become the setting for the most terrifying experience of my life. If I had known what was waiting for me in the depths of the Clearwater forest, I would have turned that RV around and never looked back. But hindsight, as they say, is 20/20, and I was about to learn that some things are better left undiscovered. The first night passed uneventfully. I slept better than I had in months, lulled by the gentle rustling of leaves and the distant hooting of an owl. When I awoke, sunlight was filtering through the RV's windows, casting dappled shadows across the interior. I stepped outside, stretching as I surveyed my surroundings. In the morning light, the clearing was smaller than I'd realized, maybe 30 feet across at its widest point. Dense undergrowth ringed the area, giving way to towering pines that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and something else, a faint, earthy smell I couldn't quite place. After a quick breakfast of instant oatmeal and strong coffee, I decided to explore the immediate area around my campsite. I grabbed my backpack, stuffing it with water, some trail mix, and a basic first aid kit, old habits from the ER die hard. As an afterthought, I tossed in the small hunting knife I'd brought along. I'd never been much for hunting, but something about the vastness of the forest made me feel I should have some form of protection. The forest floor was a thick carpet of pine needles, muffling my footsteps as I ventured away from the clearing. I hadn't gone far when I came across a small stream, its clear water bubbling over smooth stones. It was picturesque, like something out of a nature documentary. I paused to refill my water bottle, marveling at how clean and fresh the water looked compared to what came out of my tap back in Boise. As I crouched by the stream, a flicker of movement caught my eye. Across the water, partially hidden by a fallen log, was a deer. It was a young buck, its antlers still small and velvety. For a moment, we stared at each other, neither moving. Then suddenly its ears pricked up. It turned its head sharply, looking deeper into the forest, before bounding away with surprising speed. I stood up, peering in the direction the deer had looked, but saw nothing unusual. Still, a shiver ran down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had spooked the animal, something it perceived as a threat. Shaking off the unease, I continued my exploration. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and small animals. I even spotted a red fox darting between the trees, its russet coat a bright splash of color against the greens and browns of the forest. As midday approached, I found myself back at the campsite. The physical exertion and fresh air had worked up my appetite, so I set about making lunch. I'd brought a small portable grill, and soon the smell of grilling sausages filled the air. As I ate, I pored over a map of the area I'd brought with me. My finger traced the faint lines marking old logging roads and trails. One spot, marked simply as Old Clearwater, caught my attention. It was maybe a 3-hour hike from my location, an abandoned logging camp according to the map's legend. Something about it intrigued me. Perhaps it was the nurse in me, always drawn to places where human activity had left its mark. I decided that would be my destination for tomorrow's hike. A visit to this remnant of the area's logging history seemed like a perfect way to connect with the forest's past. If only I had known then what awaited me there, I might have made a very different choice. The rest of the day passed peacefully. I read for a while, losing myself in a thriller I'd brought along. As evening fell, I built a small fire, watching as the flames cast dancing shadows across the clearing. The night was clear, and as true darkness fell, the sky came alive with stars. Away from the city's light pollution, the Milky Way stretched across the heavens in a brilliant band. I stayed up late, mesmerized by the fire and the stars, feeling more at peace than I had in years. When I finally turned in, I fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. The next morning dawned bright and clear. I woke early, excited about my planned hike to Old Clearwater. I packed my backpack carefully, extra water, high-energy snacks, a basic first aid kit, my hunting knife, and a flashlight. I also threw in a small camera, hoping to document anything interesting I might find at the old logging camp. As I set out, the forest seemed different somehow. The birdsong that had been so prevalent the day before was noticeably subdued. I chalked it up to the time of day, figuring the wildlife might be less active in the increasing heat. The hike started easily enough. I followed an overgrown trail that I assumed was an old logging road. But as I ventured deeper into the forest, the path became less distinct. The trees grew closer together, their branches intertwining overhead to create a dense canopy that blocked out much of the sunlight. About an hour into my hike, I noticed something odd. The forest had gone almost completely silent. No birds, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Even the insects seemed to have gone quiet. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of my own breathing and the crunch of leaves under my feet. I paused, suddenly aware of how alone I was out here. For the first time since arriving, I felt a twinge of unease. I thought about turning back, but my curiosity about Old Clearwater won out. I pressed on, trying to shake off the growing sense of discomfort. As I hiked, the forest continued to change. The trees became older, their trunks wider and gnarled with age. The underbrush grew thicker, as if nature was reclaiming this part of the forest with particular vigor. I had to push through dense ferns and navigate around fallen logs, my progress slowing considerably. It was then that I first felt it, a sensation of being watched. I stopped, scanning the forest around me, but saw nothing out of the ordinary, just trees and shadows. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were on me, following my every move. I quickened my pace, suddenly eager to reach Old Clearwater. At least there, I thought, I'd be in a clearing where I could see my surroundings better. I checked my map again, relieved to see that I should be nearing the old camp. As I pushed through a particularly dense patch of undergrowth, I suddenly found myself on the edge of a large clearing. I had reached Old Clearwater, but nothing could have prepared me for what I was about to discover. The clearing that had once been the Old Clearwater logging camp sprawled before me, a jarring contrast to the dense forest I'd just emerged from. Sunlight streamed down, unobstructed, illuminating a scene that seemed frozen in time. Rusted machinery lay scattered about, half swallowed by encroaching vegetation. I recognized an old sawmill, its blade dulled by decades of exposure to the elements. Nearby, the skeletal remains of what must have been the main lodge sagged forlornly, its roof partially caved in. Several smaller cabins, in various states of decay, ringed the clearing, their windows dark and empty. As I stepped further into the camp, the crunch of gravel under my feet seemed unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. Not even the wind stirred. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I approached one of the better-preserved cabins, its door hanging askew on rusted hinges. Peering inside, I saw overturned furniture, moldering books, and what looked like claw marks scoring the walls. My pulse quickened. Those marks were far too large to have been made by any normal forest predator. Moving on, I noticed something odd about the plant life reclaiming the camp. The vegetation seemed wrong somehow. The ferns were larger than any I'd ever seen, their fronds an unusual deep shade of green. Vines as thick as my arm snaked up the sides of buildings and across the ground, their leaves bearing an iridescent sheen I'd never encountered before. As I examined a particularly strange-looking plant, my boot struck something solid. Looking down, I realized I'd stumbled upon a small, metallic container, half buried in the soil. Curiosity overcame caution, and I knelt to unearth it. The box was about the size of a shoebox, made of a dull metal that didn't seem to have corroded despite years of exposure. Strange symbols were etched into its surface, unlike any language I recognized. With some effort, I managed to pry the lid open. Inside, I found a stack of papers, remarkably well preserved. They appeared to be a mix of scientific notes and personal journal entries. As I skimmed the pages, certain phrases jumped out at me. The specimen continues to grow at an alarming rate. Effects on local flora and fauna far beyond our initial projections. Harris disappeared into the forest 3 days ago. The screams we heard last night. God help us all. My hand shook as I read, a cold dread settling in the pit of my stomach. Whatever had happened here, whatever these people had been involved with, it was clear things had gone horribly wrong. A sudden sound snapped me back to the present. A low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I shot to my feet, the papers falling from my hands as I scanned the clearing frantically. There, at the edge of the camp, half hidden in the shadows of the forest, I saw it. A massive shape, easily 8 feet tall, its body a nightmarish fusion of fur, scales, and what looked unsettlingly like human features. Its eyes, too intelligent to belong to any animal, fixed on me with predatory focus. For a moment that stretched into eternity, we stared at each other. Then, with horrifying speed, it moved. I caught a glimpse of claws and teeth before my survival instinct kicked in. I ran. I crashed through the underbrush, all thoughts of following the trail abandoned in my panic. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me, but I didn't dare slow down. Behind me, I could hear it pursuing, an impossible combination of speed and size crashing through the forest. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but terror kept me moving. I had no idea if I was even heading in the right direction. My only goal to put as much distance between myself and that thing as possible. Just as I felt my strength beginning to fail, I burst out of the tree line and into my campsite. Without breaking stride, I sprinted for the RV, fumbling with the keys as I reached the door. I could hear it getting closer, the sound of its pursuit growing louder. I practically fell into the RV, slamming the door behind me and locking it with shaking hands. For several agonizing moments, I waited, certain that at any second, the creature would tear through the thin walls of the vehicle. But the attack never came. Gradually, the sounds of pursuit faded, replaced by an eerie silence. I remained frozen in place, barely daring to breathe, straining my ears for any sign of the creature's presence. Hours seemed to pass, though my watch told me it had only been about 45 minutes. Slowly, cautiously, I peered out the window. The clearing appeared empty, peaceful even in the late afternoon sun. But I knew better now. I knew what was out there, hiding in the shadows of the forest. As the adrenaline began to wear off, my mind raced. What was that thing? How was it connected to the strange documents I'd found? And most pressingly, how was I going to get out of here alive? I knew I couldn't stay in the RV forever, but the thought of stepping outside, of making the long drive back down that lonely logging road with that creature possibly lurking in the woods, filled me with dread. As night began to fall, I sat in the gathering darkness of the RV, the hunting knife clutched in my white-knuckled grip, and tried to figure out my next move. One thing was certain. The peaceful retreat I had planned had turned into a desperate fight for survival, and I had a sinking feeling that my ordeal was far from over. As darkness fell, the forest came alive with sounds that just days ago I would have found soothing. Now, every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent a jolt of fear through me. I sat in the RV, all lights off, straining my eyes to peer into the impenetrable blackness outside. The hours crawled by. I didn't dare sleep, couldn't even if I wanted to. My mind kept replaying the image of that creature, its impossible form, those two intelligent eyes. I found myself analyzing every detail, my scientific mind trying to make sense of something that defied explanation. Around midnight, a new sound cut through the nocturnal chorus, a low, keening wail that raised the hair on the back of my neck. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard, carrying notes of both bestial rage and human anguish. The sound grew closer, circling the campsite. I clutched the hunting knife tighter, knowing full well how pitiful a defense it would be if that thing decided to attack. A sudden thud against the side of the RV nearly stopped my heart. Something was out there, testing the walls of my shelter. I could hear it moving around the vehicle, its breathing heavy and ragged. Then came a new sound, the slow, deliberate scrape of claws against metal. I held my breath, eyes squeezed shut, silently praying for it to leave. The scraping continued, punctuated by occasional thuds as the creature pushed against the RV. I could feel the vehicle rocking slightly with each impact. Just when I thought the walls would give way, the assault stopped. The forest fell silent again, but I didn't dare move. I remained frozen in place, listening intently for any sign of the creature's presence. Dawn found me still clutching the knife, my muscles aching from tension. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the windows, I finally allowed myself to relax slightly. I hadn't slept a wink, but adrenaline and fear kept me alert. I knew I couldn't stay here. Whatever that thing was, it knew where I was, and I doubted the RV would withstand another night of its attentions. I had to leave, to make a run for it while I had daylight on my side. With shaking hands, I gathered what supplies I could into my backpack: water, energy bars, the hunting knife, and a first aid kit. I also grabbed the mysterious documents I'd found at Old Clearwater, stuffing them into a waterproof bag. Something told me they were important, that they might hold clues to what was happening in this forest. Taking a deep breath, I cracked open the RV door. The morning air was crisp and clean, belying the horrors of the night. I scanned the clearing, looking for any sign of the creature. Seeing nothing, I stepped out, my legs trembling slightly as I made my way to the driver's seat. The engine roared to life, sounding impossibly loud in the quiet forest. I threw the RV into reverse, maneuvering carefully to turn around on the narrow logging road. As I shifted into drive, a movement at the edge of the clearing caught my eye. There it was, partially hidden behind a massive pine. Even in the daylight, its form seemed to shift and waver, as if my eyes couldn't quite focus on it. But those eyes, those I could see clearly. They bored into me, filled with a terrible intelligence and something else. Was that hunger? I slammed on the accelerator, the RV lurching forward down the rough road. In the rearview mirror, I saw the creature emerge fully from the tree line. It stood there, watching me flee, making no move to pursue. Somehow, that was even more terrifying than if it had given chase. The drive back was a nightmare. Every bend in the road held the potential for an ambush. Every shadow might have concealed that monstrous form. The RV rattled and shook as I pushed it to its limits, far faster than was safe on the deteriorated logging road. After what felt like an eternity, I burst out onto the main highway. The sight of other cars, of normal everyday traffic, nearly brought me to tears. I didn't slow down until I reached the outskirts of the nearest town, a small logging community called Orofino. I pulled into the first gas station I saw, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn off the engine. As the adrenaline began to wear off, the full weight of what I'd experienced crashed down on me. I sat there, staring blankly at the steering wheel, trying to process it all. A knock on the window startled me out of my daze. An older man in a sheriff's uniform peered in at me, concern etched on his weathered face. "You all right there, son?" he asked as I rolled down the window. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I opened my mouth to respond, to pour out the whole terrifying story, but hesitated. How could I explain what I'd seen? Who would believe me? The sheriff, Clyde according to his nameplate, must have sensed my distress. "Why don't you come on down to the station?" he suggested gently. "Looks like you could use a strong cup of coffee, and maybe someone to talk to." As I followed Clyde to the sheriff's station, my mind raced. Should I tell him everything? Would he dismiss me as some crazy city dweller spooked by the woods? Or worse, would he believe me? Because if what I saw was real, if that thing was still out there in the Clearwater forest, then this quiet little town might be in terrible danger. And what about those documents? What secrets did they hold about the origins of that creature? As I stepped into the sheriff's station, I realized my ordeal was far from over. In fact, it might have only just begun. Sheriff Clyde's office was a throwback to another era, all wood paneling and the lingering scent of cigarette smoke. As I sank into a worn leather chair, clutching a mug of strong black coffee, I found myself pouring out the whole story. To his credit, Clyde listened without interruption, his expression grave. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, a long sigh escaping him. "I wish I could say you were the first to come in here with a story like that," he said finally. "Truth is, we've been hearing whispers about something in those woods for years. Most folks write it off as campfire tales or the ramblings of overstressed loggers. But a few years back, we had a whole team of geologists go missing up there. Never did find out what happened to them." My blood ran cold at his words. "So you believe me?" I asked, hardly daring to hope. Clyde nodded slowly. "I've known these forests my whole life, son. There are things out there that defy explanation. But this," he gestured to the documents I'd brought from Old Clearwater, which lay spread out on his desk. "This is something else entirely." Over the next few hours, we pored over the papers together. They painted a disturbing picture. Decades ago, A secret government project had set up shop in Old Clearwater under the guise of a logging operation. They were experimenting with some kind of biological agent, something that could accelerate evolution. But it had gotten out of control, mutating the local flora and fauna in unpredictable ways. The final entries were frantic, describing the emergence of a creature that embodied their worst fears. A perfect predator, highly intelligent and constantly evolving. The project was abandoned in a hurry, the site sealed off, and the incident buried under layers of bureaucracy and denial. As night fell, Clyde made some calls. By morning, a team of government officials had descended on Orofino. Men in dark suits questioned me for hours, going over every detail of my encounter. They were particularly interested in the documents I'd found. In the days that followed, the Clearwater National Forest was closed off to the public, citing an ecological crisis. Military vehicles rolled through town, heading up into the mountains. We heard distant explosions, saw plumes of smoke rising above the tree line. A week later, it was over. The officials packed up and left as quickly as they'd come. The forest was reopened, with warnings about lingering environmental hazards. Life in Orofino seemed to return to normal, but I knew better. In the dark of night, I could still hear that keening wail echoing in my dreams. And sometimes, when I looked to the mountains, I could swear I saw a shape moving among the trees, always just at the edge of perception. I never returned to my job in Boise. Instead, I took up Clyde's offer to stay on in Orofino, working as a nurse at the local clinic. In my free time, I researched similar incidents around the world, gathering evidence of other experiments gone wrong, other creatures lurking in the shadows of our world. Because I know the truth now. What I saw in those woods wasn't destroyed, wasn't contained. It's still out there, evolving, waiting. And someday it, or something like it, will emerge again. When it does, someone needs to be ready. Someone needs to remember the thing in Clearwater Forest. As for me, I found a strange sort of peace here, on the edge of the wilderness. Every rustle of leaves, every unexplained sound in the night, reminds me that the world is far more mysterious and terrifying than we ever imagined. But it also reminds me that I survived, that I faced the unknown and lived to tell the tale. So I watch, and I wait, and I remember. Because in the end, that's all any of us can do in the face of the inexplicable. Bear witness and hope that when the time comes, we'll find the strength to face our fears once again. Story 10. My name is Amos Wainwright, and the events I'm about to recount happened to me in 2012. Even now, years later, I find myself hesitating as I put pen to paper. The memories are still raw, the fear still palpable. But I need to tell this story, if only to make sense of it all, and perhaps in some small way to warn others. I've been a police officer in Mendocino, California for over 2 decades. It's a small coastal town, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else's business. Most days, the biggest excitement we see is a tourist getting a little too rowdy at one of the local wineries, or maybe a domestic dispute that needs cooling down. It's a beautiful place, really. The rugged coastline, the towering redwoods, the rolling vineyards. It's postcard perfect. But like anywhere else, Mendocino has its secrets, dark corners that most folks prefer to ignore. I've got a good life here. My wife, Janice, teaches at the local elementary school. We've got 2 kids, Theo, who's just started high school, and Lucy, our little firecracker in middle school. We live in a modest house on Pallet Drive with a view of the ocean on clear days. It's the kind of life I always wanted, steady and predictable. Or at least, it was. It all started on a Tuesday in late September. The tourist season was winding down, and there was a chill in the air that hinted at the coming fall. I remember that morning clearly. Janice was making pancakes, the kids were arguing over who got the last of the orange juice, and I was sipping my coffee, skimming through the local paper. Just another normal day. I kissed Janice goodbye, ruffled the kids' hair, and headed out to my patrol car. The drive to the station was uneventful, the familiar scenery of Mendocino sliding by my window. Little did I know that this ordinary morning would be the last moment of normalcy I'd experience for a long time. The station was quiet when I arrived. Mary, our dispatcher, was at her desk, idly flipping through a magazine. My partner, Felix Rodriguez, was already there, his feet propped up on his desk as he tossed a stress ball from hand to hand. "Morning, Amos," Felix called out as I walked in. "Ready for another thrilling day of keeping the peace in our little slice of paradise?" I chuckled, hanging up my jacket. "You never know, Felix. Today might be the day we finally crack that case of Mrs. Henderson's missing garden gnomes." We shared a laugh, but there was an undercurrent of restlessness in Felix's voice. He was a good cop, sharp and dedicated, but at 28, he was still itching for more action than Mendocino usually provided. I understood. I'd been the same way when I first joined the force, but 2 decades on the job had taught me to appreciate the quiet days. I'd just settled in at my desk, ready to tackle the mountain of paperwork that seems to be the real job of small-town cops, when Mary's voice crackled over the intercom. "Amos, Felix, we've got a situation. 2 hikers reported missing up near the old Kelsey mine. Their friends just called it in." Felix was on his feet in an instant, a gleam in his eye. "Finally, some real action. Let's roll, Amos." I nodded, grabbing my jacket and gear. As we headed out to the patrol car, I couldn't shake a feeling of unease. The Kelsey mine had been abandoned for decades, and it had a reputation. Local kids dared each other to spend the night there, and there were always whispers about strange noises and unexplained lights. I'd never put much stock in ghost stories, but something about that place always set my teeth on edge. As we drove out of town, following the winding road into the hills, Felix was practically bouncing in his seat. "So what do you think happened? Maybe they fell down a shaft or got lost in one of the old tunnels." "Let's not jump to conclusions," I said, keeping my eyes on the road. "Could be they just lost track of time, decided to camp an extra night. Cell reception spotty up there." Felix nodded, but I could tell he was hoping for something more exciting. We drove in silence for a while, the dense forests closing in around us. The sky was overcast, a blanket of gray that seemed to press down on the treetops. As we neared the trailhead that led to the mine, I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the weather. We parked the car and geared up. The trailhead was deserted, no sign of the missing hiker's vehicle. "All right," I said, checking my flashlight and radio. "Let's do this by the book." We follow the main trail, calling out every few minutes. "Keep your eyes peeled for any sign of recent activity." Felix nodded, his earlier excitement tempered by the eerie quiet of the forest. We set off down the trail, our footsteps muffled by the carpet of pine needles. Every few minutes, we'd stop and call out, "Mendocino Police Department. Can anyone hear us?" Each time, our voices echoed back at us, swallowed up by the vastness of the forest. We'd been hiking for about an hour when we came across the first sign of the missing hikers. It was a campsite just off the main trail. A small tent was set up, and a fire pit had been dug, though it looked like it hadn't been used recently. "Amos, over here!" Felix called. He was crouched near a tree at the edge of the clearing, examining something on the ground. As I approached, I saw what had caught his attention, a backpack, partially hidden under some fallen leaves. I knelt down beside Felix, pulling on a pair of latex gloves. Carefully, I opened the backpack. Inside, we found a wallet, a cell phone, and some hiking supplies. The ID in the wallet belonged to Rhonda Tinsley, one of our missing hikers. Why would they leave their gear behind? Felix mused, scanning the surrounding area. I shook my head, a knot forming in my stomach. They wouldn't. Not voluntarily. We searched the campsite thoroughly, looking for any clues as to what might have happened. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, nothing to indicate foul play. It was as if Rhonda and her husband, Glenn, had simply vanished into thin air. As we finished our search of the campsite, the forest seemed to grow darker, the shadows lengthening despite the early hour. The wind picked up, whispering through the trees with an almost mournful sound. "We should press on," I said, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread. They might have wandered off the trail, gotten lost. Felix nodded, his earlier enthusiasm completely gone now. We continued down the trail, our calls growing more frequent and more urgent. The path began to narrow, winding its way through increasingly dense undergrowth. The trees pressed in close, their branches seeming to reach out like gnarled fingers. We'd gone another half-mile when Felix suddenly stopped short. "Amos," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Look." I followed his gaze and felt my blood run cold. There on a tree trunk, just off the trail, was a smear of what could only be blood. It was dark, almost black, but unmistakable. "Jesus," Felix breathed, his face pale. I forced myself to approach the tree, examining the blood smear closely. It was about chest height, and there were what looked like scratch marks in the bark beneath it. "Could be animal blood," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Maybe a wounded deer passed through here." Felix gave me a look that said he didn't believe that any more than I did. We pressed on, our senses on high alert. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves set our nerves on edge. As we rounded a bend in the trail, I caught a flash of color out of the corner of my eye. "Wait," I said, holding up a hand to stop Felix. I moved off the trail, pushing through a tangle of bushes. There, caught on a branch, was a scrap of bright blue fabric. Felix came up beside me, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. "That looks like it could be from a raincoat," he said. "Didn't the report say one of the hikers was wearing a blue jacket?" I nodded, carefully removing the fabric from the branch and placing it in an evidence bag. As I straightened up, something on the ground caught my eye. Pushing aside some fallen leaves, I uncovered a set of drag marks, as if something or someone had been pulled through the underbrush. Felix and I exchanged grim looks. This was no longer a simple missing persons case. Something had happened to Rhonda and Glenn Tinsley. Something violent. We followed the drag marks, moving deeper into the forest. The trail was long behind us now, and the going was tough. Thorny vines snagged at our clothes, and the uneven ground threatened to twist an ankle with every step. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, we emerged into a small clearing. In the center stood an old cabin, its weathered boards gray with age. The door hung askew on rusted hinges, and most of the windows were broken. "I didn't know there were any structures out here," Felix said, his voice hushed. I shook my head. "There shouldn't be. This isn't on any of our maps." We approached the cabin cautiously, weapons drawn. The drag marks led straight to the front door. As we got closer, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. Carved into the wood above the door was a crude symbol, a circle with a jagged line through it. "What the hell is that?" Felix whispered. "I don't know," I replied, "but I don't like it. Stay sharp." I pushed the door open slowly, wincing at the loud creak of the hinges. The interior of the cabin was dark, the air thick with the smell of mold and decay. I swept my flashlight across the room, revealing overturned furniture and debris scattered across the floor. As the beam of light passed over one corner of the room, Felix let out a strangled gasp. There, slumped against the wall, was a body. It was Glenn Tinsley, his face a mask of terror, his chest a bloody ruin. "Oh God!" Felix choked out, turning away. I forced myself to approach the body, my police training kicking in despite the horror of the scene. Glenn had been dead for hours, his skin cold and waxy to the touch. The wounds on his chest looked like they had been made by some kind of large animal, but there was a deliberateness to them that spoke of human cruelty. As I examined the body, something caught my eye. Carved into the floorboards next to Glenn was another symbol, similar to the one above the door but more elaborate. It looked almost like some kind of script, but not in any language I recognized. "Felix," I called, my voice sounding strange in the oppressive silence of the cabin. "We need to call this in. Get back to the car and radio for backup. I'll keep searching for Rhonda." Felix hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave me alone in this house of horrors. But he nodded, knowing that following protocol was our best chance of solving this and potentially saving Rhonda. As Felix hurried out of the cabin, I continued my search. The main room yielded no further clues, so I moved towards a door at the back of the cabin. It was slightly ajar, and as I pushed it open, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold, a muffled whimper. I burst through the door, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. There, bound to a chair in the center of the room, was Rhonda Tinsley. She was alive, but barely. Her clothes were torn and bloody, and her eyes were wide with terror. "It's okay," I said, rushing to her side. "I'm Officer Wainwright. You're safe now." As I worked to untie her bonds, Rhonda's eyes suddenly widened even further. She was looking at something behind me, trying to speak through her gag. I turned, just in time to see a massive figure lunging out of the shadows. The impact knocked me to the ground, my flashlight skittering across the floor. I found myself face to face with something that defied description. It was vaguely humanoid but larger, its skin a patchwork of fur and scales. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural yellow light, and its mouth was filled with razor-sharp teeth. I reached for my gun, but the creature was faster. Its claws raked across my chest, tearing through my uniform like it was tissue paper. The pain was excruciating, but adrenaline kept me fighting. I managed to get my hand on my weapon, pulling it free of its holster. The creature reared back, ready to strike again. I fired, the gunshot deafening in the confined space. The bullet struck the creature in the shoulder, and it let out a howl that was part animal, part human, and wholly terrifying. It staggered back, giving me enough room to scramble to my feet. I fired again and again, each shot driving the creature further back. With a final, bone-chilling shriek, it turned and crashed through one of the boarded-up windows, disappearing into the forest. My chest heaving, blood seeping through my torn uniform, I turned back to Rhonda. Her eyes were rolled back in her head. She had passed out, likely from a combination of fear and her injuries. I could hear sirens in the distance. Felix must have gotten through to dispatch. I sank to the floor beside Rhonda's chair, my gun still trained on the broken window. As the adrenaline began to fade, the pain from my wounds intensified. But worse than the physical pain was the knowledge that everything I thought I knew about the world had just been shattered. The next few hours passed in a blur. The cabin was swarming with police and paramedics. Rhonda and I were both taken to the hospital. I gave my statement, trying to describe what I had seen, but I could tell from the looks on my colleagues' faces that they didn't believe me. Hell, I wasn't sure I believed it myself. In the days and weeks that followed, an extensive search was conducted in the forest around the cabin. They found no trace of the creature I had described. The official report chalked it up to a bear attack, with my hallucination of a monster attributed to stress and blood loss. But I knew what I had seen, and I wasn't the only one. Rhonda, once she regained consciousness, told a similar story, but her account was dismissed as the ravings of a traumatized victim. Life in Mendocino gradually returned to normal, but for me, nothing would ever be the same. I found myself jumping at shadows, staying awake late into the night staring out at the dark forests that surrounded our town. Janice tried to understand, but how could I explain the terror that now lived in my heart? Felix was changed too. The eager young cop was gone, replaced by a man who seemed to have aged years in just a few weeks. He never spoke about what he had seen in that cabin, but I could see the knowledge weighing on him. As the months passed, I threw myself into research, trying to make sense of what had happened. I pored over old town records, spoke with local historians, even reached out to experts in cryptozoology. Slowly, a picture began to emerge. A history of disappearances and strange sightings stretching back to the earliest days of Mendocino's settlement. The symbol I had seen, both above the cabin door and carved next to Glenn's body, appeared in some of the oldest records. It was associated with a cult that had supposedly operated in the area in the late 1800s, a group that worshipped some kind of forest deity. But knowing the history didn't make me feel any better. If anything, it made things worse, because now I knew that the threat was still out there, hiding in the shadows of our picturesque town. I'm still a cop in Mendocino. I still patrol the streets, respond to calls, fill out paperwork. But now I'm always watching, always waiting. Because I know that someday that creature, or others like it, will return. And when it does, I'll be ready. So if you ever find yourself in Mendocino, enjoy the beautiful coastline, savor the wine, and bask in the small town charm. But remember, when night falls, stay close to the lights of town. And if you hear something moving in the shadows of the forest, don't dismiss it as just the wind or your imagination. Because in Mendocino, the monsters are real. For 3 years after that fateful day in the forest, life in Mendocino continued with an uneasy normalcy. I went about my duties, always vigilant, always watching. Janice and the kids noticed the change in me, but I couldn't bring myself to burden them with the truth. How do you tell your family that the world is far more dangerous and mysterious than they ever imagined? Then, in the summer of 2015, it happened again. It started with reports of livestock mutilations on the outskirts of town. Farmers found their animals torn apart, the wounds similar to what I'd seen on Glenn Tinsley's body. The official explanation was mountain lions, but I knew better. I tried to convince Chief Bradshaw to take the threat seriously, to increase patrols in the affected areas, but without hard evidence, my warnings fell on deaf ears. Even Felix, who had seen the aftermath of the attack in the cabin, seemed reluctant to acknowledge that it might be happening again. Then, on a warm night in August, 16-year-old Timmy Lawson went missing. Timmy had gone into the woods behind his family's property to collect firewood. When he didn't return for dinner, his parents called it in. I was first on the scene, my heart pounding with a mix of fear and grim anticipation. As I interviewed Timmy's distraught parents, my eyes kept drifting to the tree line. The forest seemed to loom larger than ever, a wall of darkness punctuated by the rhythmic flashing of fireflies. For a moment, I could have sworn I saw a pair of yellow eyes gleaming in the shadows, but when I looked again, they were gone. We organized a search party, but I insisted that no one go into the woods until daybreak. I knew that whatever had taken Timmy, it was strongest at night. Some of the other officers grumbled about the delay, but Chief Bradshaw backed me up, perhaps sensing the urgency in my voice. That night was the longest of my life. I sat in my patrol car at the edge of the Lawson property, my eyes fixed on the forest, my hand never far from my weapon. As the hours crept by, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me back, biding its time. When dawn finally broke, we began our search. I led one team, with Felix heading up another. We combed through the woods, calling Timmy's name, looking for any sign of the boy. It was Felix's team that found the first clue, Timmy's axe, abandoned in a small clearing. There was blood on the blade, and more spattered on the leaves nearby. But it was what Felix found carved into a nearby tree that made my blood run cold. The same symbol I'd seen at the cabin 3 years ago. As Felix radioed in the discovery, I noticed something else. The air had gone still, the usual forest sounds suddenly absent. And there, just visible through the trees, was a flash of blue, the same color as the jacket Timmy had been wearing. "Felix," I said, my voice low and urgent, "get everyone out of here. Now." He started to protest, but something in my eyes must have convinced him. As he hurried to evacuate the search teams, I drew my weapon and moved deeper into the forest. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of my own breathing and the crunch of leaves under my feet. I followed the occasional glimpses of blue, my every sense straining for any sign of danger. Finally, I emerged into another clearing. In the center stood a large, flat rock, its surface stained dark with what I knew instinctively was blood. And there, arranged carefully on the rock, was Timmy's blue jacket. I approached slowly, my gun at the ready. As I got closer, I saw that something had been carved into the rock's surface, a more complex version of the symbol, surrounded by what looked like ancient runes. Suddenly, a twig snapped behind me. I whirled around, coming face to face with the creature from my nightmares. It was just as I remembered, massive, inhuman, its eyes glowing with malevolent intelligence. But this time, I was prepared. As it lunged at me, I fired, the bullet striking it square in the chest. The creature staggered back, black ichor oozing from its wounds, but it didn't fall. Instead, it let out a roar that shook the trees and charged at me again. I dove out of the way, rolling to my feet and firing again. The creature was fast, but I managed to stay just out of reach of its deadly claws. We danced a deadly ballet through the clearing, neither of us able to gain the upper hand. As I fired my last bullet, I heard shouts in the distance, the search team coming to investigate the gunshots. The creature heard them too. It turned its head towards the sound, then back to me. In its eyes, I saw something I never expected, fear. With a final, ear-splitting shriek, it turned and fled into the forest. I gave chase, but it was too fast, quickly disappearing into the shadows between the trees. By the time Felix and the others reached me, I was alone in the clearing, my gun empty, my uniform torn and bloody. Timmy's jacket still lay on the rock, the only evidence that any of it had been real. We never found Timmy's body. The official report listed him as a probable victim of an animal attack, his remains likely scattered by scavengers. But I knew the truth, as did his grieving parents, who I visited to offer what little comfort I could. In the months that followed, I threw myself into my research with renewed vigor. I reached out to experts in folklore and mythology, to cryptozoologists and paranormal investigators. Slowly, I began to piece together the truth. The creature, or creatures, for I now believed there was more than one, was ancient, part of a species that had inhabited these forests long before humans arrived. The cult I'd discovered in the town's history hadn't worshipped these beings as gods. They'd made pacts with them, offering sacrifices in exchange for dark powers. I learned that the symbols were part of an old magic, binding the creatures to certain areas, but the bindings were weakening. With each passing year, the creatures were growing bolder, ranging further from their ancient territories. Armed with this knowledge, I did what I could to protect the town. I discreetly marked the boundaries of the creature's territory with symbols of protection I discovered in my research. I worked to steer development and tourism away from the deepest, darkest parts of the forest. But I knew it was only a matter of time before the creature struck again. And so I prepared, gathering weapons blessed by every faith I could find, studying ancient texts for any weakness I could exploit. Janice worried about my obsession, the long nights spent poring over old books and strange websites. The kids noticed too. I saw it in their eyes, the concern, the growing distance. But I couldn't stop. The safety of Mendocino, of my family, depended on my vigilance. And so here I am, 5 years after that first encounter in the woods, still a cop, still protecting and serving, but now with the knowledge that the greatest threat to our town lurks not in the hearts of men, but in the shadows of the forest. I'm writing this down as a record, a warning to those who might come after me. Because I know that someday the creatures will come for me. Whether out of vengeance or hunger, or some alien motive I can't fathom, they'll come. And when they do, I'll be ready. So if you're reading this, if you've noticed strange symbols carved into trees or heard inhuman cries in the night, know that you're not alone. The monsters are real, but so are those who fight them. Stay vigilant, stay strong, and whatever you do, don't go into the woods alone. Thank you for joining me tonight. I hope these stories helped you unwind and drift off into a peaceful sleep. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with friends who love a good scare. Leave a comment below with where you're from and how you liked tonight's stories. Until next time, stay safe, sleep tight, and remember, the night has its secrets. Sweet dreams.